Great. Welcome, everybody, to the fifth meeting of the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission. In a moment, I'm going to hand it over to our co-chair, Linda Nelson. As a reminder, if you have any Zoom issues, you can send a chat to Hannah Silverfine. Her name is on the screen here with tech support. She can help you, or you can email her, and she'll be able to help get you rolling here online. And as usual, the commission's not taking public comments today, but there is a link in the chat that you can make your public comments, and those will get to us, and we'll pass them along to the commission. So with that, I will hand it over to Linda, and we'll have a great meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Welcome, everyone. And thank you to our commission members. It's always good to see you, our guest speakers, and the members of the public who are joining today. As Brian noted, my name is Linda Nelson. I'm the co-chair of the commission. I'm the Economic and Community Development Director from the town of Stonington. My co-chair, Dan Tishman, is traveling and sadly unable to join us today. This is the fifth formal meeting of the commission that has gone along with site visits and public meetings in different locations, all of which have been learning experiences for me, certainly, and I hope for everybody on the commission. We have touched on a lot of topics, and we've seen a lot of the damage and the attempts to recover and the actual recoveries in our towns throughout the state from county to county. It's been very impressive, the recovery efforts, and especially in the faces of the challenges, and both anticipated and unanticipated, that our towns and cities have faced as they've had to recover from the impacts of last year's climate-related storms. So today, our meeting has two objectives. The first is for us to understand the challenges related to reliability and resilience of our electric grid infrastructure and our water systems. This is particularly important. We wouldn't even be having this meeting today if we didn't have reliable power. And I know for those of us who are small town municipal workers and large town municipal workers and just citizens, that the reliability of our electrical grid is a real thing that we actually notice and think about a lot here in Maine. So it's going to be very exciting today to learn about that and about the efforts that are already being made to improve that infrastructure and to think about what our recommendations might be as we move forward. Secondly, we need to consider those recommendations for reducing electrical outages and water system disruptions and mitigating the impact of power and water interruptions during and after disasters. And in my neck of the woods, it's not even just during and after disasters. We would love to have a more resilient, reliable power grid so that we can, as public officials, that we can heartily and heartfully recommend the move to cleaner electric power, electric vehicles, electric stoves, split heat pumps, all of these electrical appliances that are part of our Efficiency Maine programs and our green power infrastructures rely upon the reliability of our grids. So they're really complex topics, and our agenda will present several different perspectives on these systems. Thank you, Brian, for putting that in front of us. We're going to start with an overview of the energy challenges in Maine and several potential recommendations for our consideration from the Governor's Energy Office. And that will be followed by a presentation from the Maine Public Utility Commission about grid planning, climate resilience, and addressing storm damage costs. Next, as special guests from further afield, we'll hear from the state of Colorado about their approaches to grid resilience and cooperation with utilities and communities. Then we will turn to Maine's two investor-owned utilities to learn about storm impacts, recovery, and long-term resiliency efforts. Finally, after a short break, we will discuss with several of our own commission members about the challenges and opportunities within our drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater systems. At the end of the meeting, we will, as always, spend time in a group discussion about ideas and recommendations that are emerging from today's meeting. In order for us to get to that discussion, I do ask that our speakers and our guests do your very best. I know you have a lot of information, and much of it is very, very important to us. Try to hold within the timeframes that we have allotted for you if possible. So with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome our own commission member and director of the Governor's Energy Office, Dan Burgess, who will lead us off today. Following Dan, we'll hear from Carolyn Gilbert, a commissioner at the Maine Public Utilities Commission. Dan.
Thank you so much, Linda, and to the entire Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission for allowing me to be here, and to the colleagues from the Utilities Commission, Colorado, and as well as the utilities for joining as well. This process has been eye-opening and a real learning experience for me personally, and I look forward to this discussion on energy. As was mentioned, I'm going to give a high-level overview of Maine's energy landscape. There's a lot more that could be talked about on each of these areas, but really my primary objective is to provide a sense for the commission and for folks listening of some of the key issues and challenges that we face. And then again, we'll talk about some of the recommendations that for consideration. Look forward to that discussion. Brian, if we could go to the next slide. At a really high level, I want to give an overview of our starting on the electric grid and the various roles and responsibilities. Most of Maine is part of a regional transmission grid operated by an entity called ISO New England. They have several core responsibilities: planning the transmission system and working closely with transmission owners, administering the region's wholesale electricity markets, and operating the bulk power system to ensure reliability. So ISO New England manages the regional transmission grid that we are a part of. They are regulated by an entity called FERC, and many of the reliability criteria that ISO and the utilities plan to are established by NERC, or the North American Reliability Corporation. Hopefully that'll be the end of some of the acronyms that I have to give, because I want to make sure that I'm not an acronym soup here, but did want to make sure that this commission understood the how ISO New England operates and who they're regulated by. We represent about 10% of electricity demand in the New England region. One unique portion of Maine's electric grid is the Northern Maine system, which is administered by a separate entity, the Northern Maine Independent System Administrator. They actually operate outside of ISO New England and is only directly connected to New Brunswick in Canada, not the rest of New England. So that is an interesting feature of Maine's electric system, is the part to the north, which is managed by another entity. We have two large utilities, Central Maine Power and Versant, who together serve about 96% of the state's electric customers, and both utilities operate transmission and distribution networks. The distribution systems are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, who we're going to hear from soon. There are also 10 municipally owned or cooperative utilities across the state that serve the remainder, including some islands as well. The chart you're seeing comes from ISO New England and summarizes several of the key factors shaping our power grid today, namely the region, all of New England region, the transition in recent decades from significant use of coal and oil to produce our electricity to primarily natural gas, which makes up almost half of the region's electricity mix today. What you can see in this chart, so on the left, the bottom, you can see the transition from the year 2000 to 2022, significant reduction in coal. Sorry if you go back one, Brian. Coal, and then in the middle, the reduction in oil, and then the right, the transition to natural gas. And all the way to the right, you're able to see kind of where new resources are coming online. And the new resources in the region are predominantly on and offshore wind power, solar, battery storage, and the necessary transmission needed to interconnect that. Next slide. So when you think about energy reliability or resilience, I think it's important to think about adequacy. Do we have the energy that we need? So ISO New England, these charts come from ISO New England, highlighting some of the overall regional vulnerabilities that we have at the bulk power system. And we work closely with the energy folks on this call and other folks in the region on these issues. We are over-reliant on fossil fuels, particularly in the natural gas sector, to power, to make electricity. And natural gas supplies are periodically constrained in the winter when it's coldest, when supplies need to go towards heating. And in these situations, power plants switch to other fuels, primarily oil, which is only stockpiled on site. So replenishing both natural gas, which when pipelines are constrained is imported by sea via LNG or liquefied natural gas tankers, and oil are what's characterized here in this slide from ISO New England as a fragile supply chain. And as we look to the future, we anticipate continued electric growth. I just wanted this on the right-hand side. You can see ISO New England's modeling for the region, continued electric growth, driven by a number of factors, but primarily in the winter, the blue components there, home heating in particular, which will have important implications of the power system, as Linda mentioned. Next slide. I won't spend really any time on these charts except for to note two important trends on the left. ISO New England data that they publish estimate really looking at on-site fuel storage for power plants and how much fuel is on-site and how long that would maintain if they were to be burned continuously. Really just pointing out the kind of just-in-time nature of some of the supply chain of fuels. And on the right, you can see, ISO New England and EA and others are tracking how much fuel is actually located on these sites. Next slide. So as we've experienced in recent years, that gives you a sense, I think, of resource adequacy and ensuring that we have the electricity needed when the power or when we need it. This is really kind of transitioning to outages, as we've talked about. So this chart is from the Energy Information Administration from the calendar year 2022. And if you look back, there are similar trends, but Maine customers on average experienced about 3 outages and a total of 15.5 hours of outages in 2022. We are the most forested state in the country, and I think we're going to hear from the utilities later today about the cause of those outages and opportunities to address them. But this really compares the outage lengths and the number of outages by New England states from 2022. Next slide. So that's the electricity sector. I think just as critical is the delivered fuel sector. Maine is the most home heating oil dependent state in the country. You can see that middle green bar represents the percentage of homes that are dependent on home heating oil. Going back to 2010, that number was about 70%. Going to today, or 2022, the latest data that we have on the right, that number is about 56%. So we've seen a reduction, particularly over in the last 5 years, of Maine's reliance on home heating oil. And that has gone with an increase in propane, but also on the bottom, you can see an increase in folks using electricity to heat their home, particularly as we look towards the electrification with heat pumps. Next slide. This gives you a sense of how we obtain those heating fuels. They are all imported. We are not producing fossil fuel products here in Maine. Primary supply chains are by sea, tankers and barges, or by truck or rail. There's some pipeline infrastructure within the region to transport liquid fuels, but it predominantly comes by sea. Chart on the right comes from the Energy Information Administration, tracks oil stocks over the past 5 winters. This is the average. The kind of gray bar, the large gray bar, the highs and lows of that. And really what I wanted to point out here is that in last winter and really the kind of last couple of years, as a result of global energy market challenges, which I'm happy to talk more about, the stocks for oil supplies have been at historic lows. And so as we think about the fuel that Maine residents and businesses need to heat their homes, we are paying close attention to oil stocks as a region. I'll note that we have every winter we have weekly calls with other states and industry looking at these trends. And I should have noted that ISO New England also does a 3-week look ahead, looking at temperatures, looking at other items to identify if there's any vulnerabilities or any issues being planned or that could be foreseen. Next slide. think one important area I wanted to make this group aware of is that the governor has the authority to declare energy emergencies. And that has happened some winters, typically around when there are longer cold snaps or significant storms. There were 3 declared last winter: the December storm, again one in January, and then a shorter one more focused in April. But really, this energy emergency proclamation allows fuel delivery crews to stay on the road longer, to allow them to deliver fuel, which may take longer. There may be take longer to reach folks as a result of snow, wind, debris. May also take longer for folks to be waiting in line at the fuel delivery depots to be getting their trucks filled. So there were 3 last winter, and oftentimes can happen during those winter storms. Next slide, please. I'm not going to spend really much time on this at all, except for to note that Maine has a number of energy policy requirements that intersect with resiliency, from the deployment of clean energy and energy storage, both at the larger scale level and the distributed level, and then also oil dependence reduction requirements and electrification of heating and transportation targets, as well as weatherization. And so we're continuing to see those oil dependence reduction targets be met. Of course, more reliance and more adoption of heat pumps and weatherization technologies. Next slide. What I'll also say is that, and Commissioner Gilbert, I think, will speak more in detail about a lot of the integrated grid planning and climate protection plan requirements that are underway as a result of the governor's 2022 utility accountability bill, which I want to highlight. Established new performance and transparency requirements, as well as strengthened some of those planning functions to ensure that the electricity system is resilient for the future. So the utilities have to file new grid plans every 5 years, and then climate change protection plans every 3 years. Those are all new requirements over the last 2 years. Next slide. 2 other planning items I want to make sure the Commission was aware of. One is our 2048 energy plan, which we've been working on for the past few months, looking at what the energy system will look like in 2040 and how we're planning for it. And then a new requirement on our office is the creation of a state energy security plan. So all state energy offices in the country like ours, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law, have to put forward state energy security plans to the U.S. Department of Energy to identify, assist, and mitigate risks of energy infrastructure, and looking at how to best prepare for and respond to those events. And so we are furiously working away on that state energy security plan, that will be an emergency support function annex of the state's already existing comprehensive energy operations plans, which I know this group has talked about. Finally, I want to talk about one particular program which our office has awarded $6.5 million in funding for. It is the Maine Grid Resilience Program. That comes from the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're going to receive about $10 million in funding for this, but it's really to invest in strengthening the resilience of the electric grid. We've, as I mentioned, awarded about $6.5 million. Having seen a couple of these projects firsthand, I do want to highlight, how impactful they are. We were in Van Buren as an office earlier this year, where that is a municipally owned cooperative utility, and they have about 300 plus poles that have not been replaced in decades. And the funding that we've received from the federal government and now to this program will replace every single one of those 300 plus poles. Other grants you can see on this are going to result in more than 50 miles of distribution line upgrades, enhanced vegetation management, or the managing trees and vegetation around our electric wires, but also new and upgrades to grid hardening technologies, and one battery storage microgrid project. So we're excited about these projects and feel like we were, I believe, my team can correct me, but I believe we were oversubscribed. And so I think there's more of these projects that could come in the pipeline. and we'll be receiving another about $4 million over the next 2 years for that. Finally, I'll pivot to draft recommendations. A few ideas that we've talked about after laying out some of these issues. While we have access to information through existing processes, we see an opportunity for additional baseline assessments and data collection, including to inform future investments that might be needed. So the first one's around data and baseline assessments. We also see an important opportunity to advance deployment of or continuing to advance resilient clean energy technologies like solar and storage. I want to build resilience for vulnerable populations and critical facilities that need to be operational during times of outages and storms, and opportunities to do more with regards to microgrids. We're going to continue to engage regionally on some of these winter reliability solutions that we talked about, and it's important to keep those conversations going. And then finally, we want to understand and plan for challenges that we've talked about today, and particularly related to things like volatile and vulnerable fuels, and especially to the impact of home heating. Don't have time to talk about it given the time frame, but many of Maine's folks that are participating in, let's say, Maine Housing's programs are reliant on fuels like kerosene to heat their home. That's kind of bunched into the home heating oil number, and we've seen challenges in the past few years with supply and price of kerosene, and certainly I think that has an impact to folks that are heating with those fuels. So I think with that, I covered a lot in that time frame. Tried not to go too deep into any. I think we could talk a lot about these each of these slides, but I want to hand it over, I think, Linda, to Commissioner Gilbert, or when you're ready, and appreciate the Commission's work and ongoing engagement. Look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. Really great overview, and appreciate the breadth of it. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot more for us to discuss there, and we look forward to digging into it with you. Next up, though, we have Carrie Gilbert from Maine PUC. Carrie.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks, Dan, for that overview. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm one of the commissioners at the PUC, and we have a lot going on in many different areas, which is probably applicable to resiliency. But today I'm just going to talk about three things: the integrated grid planning, which Dan already touched on a little bit, and then our climate change protection plans, which Dan also mentioned. And then we've actually initiated a resiliency docket ourselves. So we're very interested in actually learning more about what you guys are up to, because I imagine there's some overlap. But anyway, we can go to the next slide and I'll talk about the grid planning. So these slides are a little dense. I wanted you guys to have all the information to take away with you later. But as Dan mentioned, the integrated grid planning came out of some legislation in 2022. And basically what the integrated grid plans are is it started a process, a 5-year, every 5 years, by which the investor-owned utilities, which are CMP and Versant, would be required to file 10-year grid plans. So even though the planning cycle will be every 5 years, they're going to be providing 10-year plans. And prior to starting the process of the planning, we had a stakeholder process at the PUC to identify the priorities for those plans, and to talk about how to develop things like assumptions and how the utilities should evaluate investments that they might make in those grid plans. So there was quite a robust stakeholder engagement process to develop those priorities and sort of what the contents of the plan should be. We had 13 meetings and workshops with stakeholders. We hired a consultant who helped sort of guide that process, and we established working groups on specific areas like forecasting, the solution evaluation criteria. Eventually we came to a straw proposal or outline of the expected content of the grid plans, and we solicited and received comments on that. And then I think we can go to the next slide, which is so the outcome of all of that, so at the commission, the way we speak is through our orders, which is a little bit formal, more formal than maybe some of us would prefer, but it is a nice way of sort of laying out what needs to come next. So the grid planning order that we issued that in July of this year, and that set the priorities for the grid plans, which were, we selected 3 priorities, which were reliability and resilience improvements, improving data quality and integrity, and promoting flexible management of customers' resources and energy consumption. So those are the priorities that CMP and Versant are working to. But then we also laid out some components that we wanted to see in the plan. So those include the utilities visions over the next 10 years and how the investments that they're proposing are achieving both the priorities and their visions. We specified which forecast should be used in the plans. That was something that was somewhat controversial, I think, amongst the stakeholders, because certain stakeholders were advocating for using the most aggressive forecast around decarbonization, and others wanted to be more conservative. And in some ways, being more conservative would keep the costs of improvements lower. So that was an interesting discussion. There's a scorecard in there for evaluating proposed investments in technologies. There's a requirement that the utilities propose a way to evaluate equity and environmental justice impacts. But really the goal of these plans is to figure out what improvements are needed and do it in such a way by proactive planning that will keep costs affordable and enable the state to meet its climate goals. Okay, I think we can go to the next one, which is our next steps. So here's a timeline of the next steps in the grid planning. So we issued that order, as I said, in July, and then CMP and Versant have 18 months to develop their grid plans. So they're going to be due in January of 2026. And in between now and then, there's some requirements around stakeholder engagement that both utilities have. And there's sort of 3 check-in points, sort of, I would say it's sort of minimum requirements around stakeholder engagement. And then after they file the plans, there'll be a 60-day public comment period. And then the commission will evaluate the plans. And we, at that point, we could order the utilities to revise the plans and address any deficiencies, if there are any. And then we also, once we have this information, we can use it in our other dockets around, say, like a rate case or what have you. And then the next process will start for the next set of grid plans in November of 2027. So that's the grid planning process. We can go to the next one. So the next thing is the other thing that Dan mentioned is the climate change protection plan. So these are also 10-year plans, but filed on every 3 years. These plans are filed by all of the electric utilities, not just CMP and Versant. So it includes the consumer-owned utilities. And these plans are meant to address actions that the utilities would need to address to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So whereas the other one includes that as well, but this is really focused on, you know, sea level rise or increasing storms, or what are utilities need to do to address those vulnerabilities. And the first plans of this type were filed last December. And in those plans, I mean, they sort of varied because we have some very small consumer-owned utilities who didn't have as many resources, and then larger utilities like CMP and Versant. But some of the larger utilities were planning to do vulnerability assessments and resiliency and mitigation plans as part of their process. I think on the next slide, I've got the timeline going forward for that. So just going over the timeline. So we had last December, those plans were filed, and then public comments were filed last January. And then this March, we realized, I guess we might have moved a little slow there, but sometimes, but so after so this March, we realized we needed to bring in some technical assistance for some of those smaller consumer-owned utilities. So we hired Berkeley Lab, and then we held a workshop this August with the consumer-owned utilities, and all of this is aimed at the next set of plans, which are due in December. So we've got some plans about doing more assistance for those smaller utilities for the next plan, and maybe providing a framework or something to help them as they develop their plans. Okay, I think that's okay. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is we have initiated an inquiry into resiliency ourselves. So basically, we initiated this in response to the increased storm activity and outages we're seeing, and really also the cost of that activity on our customers. This graph is just showing in 2023 the cost of all the storm activity on CMP system. And I'm not trying to pick on CMP, but we just happen to have that data. But you can see that over the course of the year, the cost of storm response was almost $200 million. And, you know, that ends up on customers' bills eventually, generally. And so given how much money that customers are spending on responding to storms and repairing the system, we thought it would be worthwhile to spend some time figuring out if there was a better way to do things. So, and that is very broad. We're just starting this inquiry, but we're wondering about things like, is there a better way to do tree trimming? Should we be undergrounding more lines? Should we be doing something innovative, like we learned about a way of putting a line that they're doing in California, where it's on the ground with this like pipe thing on, like it's like a cover on top of it. Anyway, it sounded worth exploring. And then, are there things we can do on the customer side to provide more resiliency during outages, so you're not losing the contents of your freezer or your refrigerators? You know, what basically we want to know what's out there that we should be deploying in Maine that we're not. So we have had initial comments. We're doing that docket on September 4th, and then we're planning a workshop for mid to late October. We don't quite have that scheduled yet, but for that, we're going to bring in some assistance from the national labs again, and hopefully they'll be able to help us understand what other states are doing that we might want to copy here in Maine. So I think that's that. I think that's all I had.
That's great, Carrie. Thanks very much.
Sure.
We have a little bit of time before we begin to focus on our guests from Colorado and examples of innovation. A little bit of time for a few questions. And I would like to begin by just asking if one of you, Dan or Carrie, could describe for those of us who may not be in state government and have this understanding, how the governor's office, the PUC, and the utilities work together, and how those plans, all those plans you're talking about, how they integrate and tear down.
To be honest, I ask how those plans integrate every day. But that's I'll let Dan explain that, because I feel like that's his purview. But.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question, and you know, I think they're all interrelated. Take load growth, for example, electrification of heating and transportation. I think that, you know, that is being planned for at the regional level. It is also being planned for at the Climate Council and our energy plan level. Carrie just mentioned they have made a decision about load growth and grid planning for the utilities plans. And I think CMP and Versant Joe would also say that maybe it's not the same exact number, but it's pretty close, right? And I think we will need to strive for more collaboration there, but that'll give us a sense of what's the demand on the grid going to need to look like. And I think as we kind of have that, we can, to your point, Linda, flow down of, okay, where is this going to happen specifically? What do the circuits look like? What are the investments that are needed? So I think it's not a perfect symphony, but I think it's generally in the same songbook.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dan. I mean, on the grid planning piece, we definitely talked about how we could make sure that the assumptions that we were having the utilities use were most consistent with the work that the governor's energy office was doing on the 2040 study and the climate change council work. So it's definitely something we think about.
Thank you. Thank you both. Other questions from the commission? Judy.
Just a quick comment about the potential collaboration with communities. Back in, I think it was 07, 08, where I live, Calais got a project canopy planning grant to do a tree inventory in the city, and those grants are still available. And while there were certain public officials that saw it as some sort of green sneaker, the electric company was immediately, let's have it. We need this, and they've used it to develop resilience within the grid just locally. And I think that's a real opportunity for towns to feel like they have some agency to contribute to this resiliency. So just an observation, those grants are available every year.
Thank you, Judy. Charlie.
I have a question for Dan. So BOEM will offer the first Gulf of Maine lease sale for in the end of October. And so things are starting to reel for the first time in a long time. Question is, I do not expect a definitive answer to this, but I'm very interested in the question where the electricity generated from offshore is going to come onshore. Because the wind, some of the wind leasing area is southeast of Maine. Some of it is closer to Massachusetts, but the Stellwagen Bank, sanctuary lies between those leasing areas and coming onshore in Massachusetts. The question of where this electricity comes on shore creates a new additional set of infrastructure and resiliency issues that I think we want to think about, even though we know that we don't have definitive answers on it. I'm just wondering where the thinking on that is these days. If there'd be some discussion about it, even though of course it'll all depend on where the companies want to do.
Yeah, thanks. Breaking up a little bit there, but I think I caught the thrust of the question, Charlie. I think for those that are, so the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, also known as BOEM, is within the U.S. Department of Interior. They're responsible for the leasing of offshore wind energy areas in the Gulf of Maine. After a multi-year process, they have narrowed down the lease areas for, there will be 8 lease areas that are auctioned off to developers to develop them October 29th of this month. That was just announced. What is going to drive the development of those projects will be, or has been historically in other states, state-sponsored power purchase agreements. So states have had, you're seeing to our south, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, having their utilities sign long-term contracts for the energy. So to answer your question, Charlie, I think is a good one. Where will these projects interconnect? I think there are a host of locations and sites in the Gulf of Maine, both in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. We are have done and are continuing to do, now that we know where the lease areas are, continued analysis of what that might look like and look at, what the impacts might be. We're doing a lot of that work in conjunction with ISO New England and their 2050 transmission study. And so I think it's an important question to consider, particularly as we think about long-term infrastructure, and would welcome feedback now and offline as well.
Thanks, Charlie, for the question, and thanks, Dan, for the response. Do we have other questions or comments at this stage of our presentations today? Seeing none, we will move on with the agenda. Thank you all very much. Thanks again to Dan and to Carrie for those presentations. The next section of our agenda has innovation examples from Colorado. So we're going to turn to our guests from there for examples of how they are innovating in their own energy grid. So we have two presenters, and then we'll have a little bit more Q&A after both presenters. Marguerite Harden is the local resiliency program manager in the Colorado Resilience Office, and John Parks is a policy analyst at the Colorado Energy Office. So Marguerite, John, welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much. I'm John Parks. I'm from the Colorado Energy Office, and I know we just don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to set my timer here. And let's see. We will talk a little bit about our grid resilience funding. So this is our formula funding, which is from the IIJA, or Investment Infrastructure and Jobs Act, Section 40101D. Next slide, Marguerite. So we're going to talk a little bit about our grid resilience funding, our planning and policy overview, and then I'm going to kick it over to Marguerite, who's going to talk about the microgrids for community resilience program and the lessons learned, and we'll have some time for questions. Next slide. All right, so we are working on getting our funding out the door for the grid resilience funding. We recognize that the situation in Colorado is a bit different from that in Maine. I understand that 96% of the Maine electric customers are served by the two IOUs, where in Colorado we have, I believe, 54 retail utilities, and about, I believe, 67% of our customers are served by our two IOUs. So one thing that's in that funding is that the proportion of the customers served by the small co-ops and municipal utilities needs to be equivalent to the amount that's provided to those organizations. Next slide. So this shows you a little bit about how we broke up our funding. And so different from most states, we ended up not having one grid resilience program, but three. So we have on the left there's the microgrids for community resilience. And that is a program that is actually administered by Marguerite and her colleague, Julia Masters, through the Department of Local Affairs, Colorado Resiliency Office. And you can see the dark blue and the light blue, that shows the year 1 and 2 match and allocation. So you might know it's a 5-year program, and the first 2 years of funding came out together from 2022 and 2023. We made a decision to prioritize microgrids as kind of a directive and a solution. And so we put more money into that bucket. The grid hardening for small and rural communities and advanced grid monitoring, those are both managed by me in the Colorado Energy Office. What our thinking there was that we knew that the number of outstanding projects for grid hardening and for grid monitoring were just more than we could ever meet. We could never meet those needs. And so we wanted to meet the most critical needs while also creating this focus on the microgrids. We did realize that during the first session of funding the programs from my office, the grid hardening, advanced grid monitoring, were oversubscribed, whereas microgrids was initially undersubscribed. And so in that third year of funding, we adjusted the numbers to match the need. Next slide. And we also have this microgrid roadmap that we're working on. This is part of the technical assistance. So we have different legislation that is supporting this. So there's legislation that requires us to make this microgrid roadmap. If you look on the left side there's a map of Colorado. And what that identified is overlapping vulnerabilities in the state. Infrastructure vulnerabilities, meaning those communities that are kind of at the end of a radial feeder social vulnerabilities, low, moderate income households, linguistically isolated, transportation isolated folks, and climate vulnerabilities, the areas that are really most at risk of wildfire and heat, extreme heat. And then we've got this funding that is for the Microgrids for Community Resilience program, came from another bill, and that is actually where we got our state funding for the match, because this formula funding requires a 15% state match. So that's why in the previous slide you saw that all of that first year of funding went to the Microgrids for Community Resilience. And there, I'll pass it over to Marguerite.
Thanks so much, John. I'm going to take a deeper dive into this Microgrids for Community Resilience Program, or MCR, if you want to advance to the next slide. It sounds like everyone here is pretty familiar with what a microgrid is, but I have left our definition up here in the right column. And essentially, we really need a microgrid to be capable of balancing supply and demand, as well as operating outside of the grid in island mode. And the purpose of this program is really to build the resilience of community level resilience throughout Colorado. And I'll get into a little bit more about how we define that in the next slide. And so, yeah, here is just a quick snapshot. To John's point, this is a blend of both state funding, which actually came before that the federal funding was even available, as well as primarily that federal funding. And John mentioned how the microgrids program was undersubscribed. We have had 3 pretty intentional rounds of funding where we have capped the amount available each time. And I think that's been really helpful for communities to understand what a microgrid is, understand where it could best be applied, to fund planning grants. And I'll talk more about us building sort of microgrid pipeline in the state and how that has looked. Clearly, there's some early adopters who have wanted microgrids as part of their grid resilience strategy for a while. And you can see a kind of a cluster of them, especially in the Southwest. That's one utility particularly. But yeah, I think by having 3 rounds of funding, we've really been able to kind of build that pipeline of microgrids and build up the interest for that. So we've had about 25 projects representing about 30 microgrids. Some of these awards have multiple microgrids in them, and about 10.7 million in grant awards of our dollars, and including match, that's nearly $18 million that we've put towards microgrids. And you can see here just the mix of planning grants and construction grants, as well as through that map. The map doesn't highlight as many as the number on the right. You'll see a disconnect there, but that's largely because we have a number of awards that are pending and not yet publicly announced. I will go into some of those more exciting ones in some examples on the next slide. Well, first, here's a few more metrics and outcomes of the program. So we do have a focus on supporting DI communities. About 56% of those awards are going to DI communities so far, with 5 of those awards being in Justice 40 communities. We have a Colorado EnviroScreen tool that maps in a much more broad way than Justice 40, but we really think defines who these communities are more specifically. And then we've also just, done a lot of this pipeline building and education awareness on vulnerabilities and solutions. Next slide. So here I'm going to run through, just to hope to get to Q&A quicker. I'm going to run through some examples in the next 3 slides, but you're welcome to come back or ask me questions about any of these projects. One thing that came out of the microgrids roadmap was that we need to be thinking about microgrids in this sort of scale. And we have 3 levels here: a single building, a campus, or a partial feeder, as well as a full feeder. And so you can see that kind of broad spectrum of what a microgrid is, going from as small as, the smallest I think we've awarded is this 37 kilowatt battery, which is on a single building, which is considered a resilience hubs, more on that later, all the way up to a 5 megawatt battery, which actually our federal funding is only a drop in the bucket on the cost of that lease that the utility is actually designed in order to support an entire community that has a lot of outage history. And then right in the middle there, which I think we see probably the most of, is just like partial feeder or partial, a few multiple facilities in that sweet spot in the middle. Next slide. So there's a number of reasons why folks might get a microgrid. Here I've listed 3 benefits. One is communications resilience. And, when coming out of the Lahaina disaster, you saw the communications go down, and that just exacerbated the entire disaster. This is hoping to prevent a situation like that in the Southwest with the San Miguel Power Association, SMPA utility, where they are actually attaching their battery to their communications office. So their utility office is now going to have this backup power, which will ensure communications if there's ever a disaster. They actually had a history of this happening once, and so there's a precedent for the demand for this sort of a battery. Generally, we wouldn't go onto sort of a more private or not community facing facility, but in this case, there were just benefits to the full service area. The next benefit, grid resilience, pretty obvious, but this example does highlight a non-battery system, so a combined heat and power system. Then there's economic resilience. We're seeing folks interested in putting these onto industry level, facilities as well as businesses or retail. And this system, this PVREA all the way on the right, is an example of also a pretty full feeder system. Next slide. Education and engagement. This is a pending award, but we see the city and county of Denver interested in having a competition amongst schools within the city, and the winning school will install a battery. So building this awareness for resilience, which we think is wonderful. Public health. This health center in Pueblo is a federally qualified health center. So ensuring we are not going to be funding really private hospitals with our federal or state dollars, but really these community facing facilities that support low-income communities. So they'll be getting a battery to support critical loads. And I've linked to Collective Energy, which has a huge DOE award for this sort of work in the Southeast, but they're supporting health centers across the country, which is really great organization if you want to connect with them. And finally, the last example is just supporting vulnerable populations. Here we have 2 different microgrids and 1 award for the city of Westminster, but one for Mature Adult Center, which is an emergency shelter, as well as a resiliency hub. Next slide. And so here's just more background on how we have decided to encourage applications for the program. Vulnerable communities, of course, I have a link to a tool, but we also allow for qualitative, not just quantitative measures of what vulnerable means to that community. We have this anchor institution focus, which I've defined anchor institutions on the right. And again, supporting that pipeline. So ensuring that we have planning grants and funding, as well as technical assistance. I've linked to a lot of technical assistance. That's actually a lot of it's available nationally, including to Maine communities. And on the next slide is a new process that we are actually currently piloting, but as part of the microgrid roadmap, we've realized that we really would like to see not just utilities providing proposals for where a microgrid could go, but also having community buy-in for what the most important facilities are. So this is a draft process, taking communities through that for prioritizing their critical facilities, and there's more information at that link. Next slide. So again, I'm not the program manager for the microgrids community program. Julia is, she's out today, but happy for John and I to answer any questions. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, John and Marguerite. That was a great presentation and has raised a lot of interesting questions and information, I think. And I look to the commission to see what those are for you.
I can't find my hand raised fast enough, but
okay, Hannah.
I mean, it probably could be helpful maybe when the utilities and Dan come back to sort of have a little more information about microgrids in Maine, because we have done some work here, but it's really inspiring to see and hear about the work in Colorado. I think, Marguerite, your presentation sort of started to delve into this for those specific examples. But almost as an education for all of us on thinking about the opportunities of microgrids. It looked like a lot of the projects were very almost building specific or critical building specific, which I think is incredibly relevant to this commission, because I think we are thinking about, Dan showed a map of the extended outages Maine faces and what that could mean for critical facilities. So that is essential. microgrids, at least in my uneducated understanding of them, can be broader. And I will say, Linda lives in a fishing town down a long peninsula that has seen a lot of outages. And I know that Maine and other states have looked at microgrids as a way to even enhance a smaller region in a more sort of a larger community. So I'm just wondering, John or Marguerite, if you could sort of help educate us on at least how Colorado thinks about how large a microgrid could be to how small. And I think your grant sizes were on an earlier slide, but just trying to wrap our minds around the magnitude of investment. Your microgrid comments don't also talk about the benefits it could mean for electricity grid prices and sort of overall benefits. And maybe, again, we can ask Joe or Versant to talk about that when they come up. So John or Marguerite, if you could just tell us a little bit more about microgrids and sort of how broadly Colorado thinks about them. And obviously you gave some very specific building examples as well.
Yeah, I can jump in there, and John, feel free to add anything. But I'd say it's probably slide 10 where I showed that kind of scale of level 1 to level 3 sized microgrids. I think what you're talking about, like level 1 is just a single building, but we are supporting some of those level 3 feeders. The amount of funding required for some of those really larger projects are not within the scope of what the state has enough funding for currently. And so we are focusing probably more on the levels 1 and 2, although level 3, we're seeing utilities take on their own, in part because of the value of reliability and resiliency, and that they can justify those investments more so than some of the larger scale hardening that would maybe need to take place in order to build that resilience otherwise. So this, the previous slide before this one, or was it? It's actually slide 8, shows kind of the minimum and maximum awards. Oh, sorry. Yes, up back one more. Okay, yes. So those minimum and maximum budgets, and we just launched this program 2 years ago, and so we learned a lot through this process. We've actually increased our maximum award for construction up to 2.5 million. We started, I think, at 1.5, but just are seeing that demand for larger projects. We are reticent to go up higher than 2.5 million, I think, because it would be just supporting one microgrid in one community, and we would like to see these funds going out to more places, being a large state with a lot of different utilities. So yeah, and then in terms of the question on valuation and how we can help prioritize that, that's been a large topic in the microgrids roadmap. I see you're unmuted, John. I don't know if you wanted to jump in on that.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up that point, Hannah, about the valuation of microgrids, and that's something that we and anybody else who's focused on microgrids is kind of trying to figure out, because if you put all of the value just on the resilience piece of it, that you end up using maybe 1% of the time or less, it's difficult to make that cost benefit analysis work, right? But if you look at other value streams that a microgrid can bring in terms of reducing the load on the peaks, and grid stabilization and other values, that from reliability, that can make the case a lot better. And so in our document for the microgrid roadmap, which is a couple slides earlier, you can there's a link to it, and you can look at that. It's in draft format right now, but we've got some policy pathways looking at different ways to evaluate and include those value streams.
Hannah, thanks for the question, and Marguerite and John, thanks for the responses on that. I want to dig down one level further and have you talk a little bit about, you mentioned resilience hubs several times, and I think that is kind of a single building microgrid in some instances, but could you just tell us how you're defining resilience hubs?
Yeah, we have a website that I believe I linked to in the PowerPoint that kind of breaks it down, and it really follows the USDN sort of guide, which I think is what a lot of people refer to when they talk about resilience hubs. Energy resilience is just one of, I think, 5 critical elements of a resilience hub. It also needs to do much more than just, you know, being sure you can keep the power on when the lights are off. And it's really meant to serve a purpose during blue sky days, not just, you know, when there's a disaster. And that really ensures that that space is a trusted community facility. And so, yeah, more thanks to John for, oh, you dropped that in just to me. If you'd like to drop that into the chat for everyone, that we have the link for resilience hubs there. But yeah, this is, you know, we have mixed opinions about resilience hubs. I've heard from some localities that it's a sort of wonky term and we should just be calling them community centers. I think resilience hubs helps us think about that holistic approach to the energy resilience, to the community resilience, and to just the resources that a community needs that it provides, which is very much based in what the community needs. Yeah, right. Like, we're not telling a community what they need, but they get to self-define if they need workforce development support or language services, right? And so resilience hubs is both a really broad term with just some key aspects and requirements.
Great, thank you. Dan.
Yeah, thanks so much to the Colorado team for the presentation. It's really thought-provoking and great to have you here. Just so for comparison, the 40101D program that you talked about, that's a portion of your funding. That's the same formula fund that we have. I think y'all just received more given the it's, you know, formula based on population. The microgrids for community resilience, that's funded from the general fund or from the legislature. What was the amount of funding for that?
Yeah, it was only 3.5 million from the general fund back in 2022. So it does expire soon. And we have been trying to be really strategic. 3.5 million is not much in the scheme of things. So we've used that for a match for the federal dollars. But you know, the federal dollars are pretty limited in that they want utilities to be the main applicant. We've figured out a way of allowing local governments that sell energy, whether that's like one solar panel or more, to be qualified for the federal dollars, as well as nonprofits, which has really allowed us to expand who can get that funding. But we did kind of save the more flexible state funding then for those applicants, as well as the renewable systems that connect to microgrids. So the federal funding doesn't allow for new generation. You can maybe replace parts on existing, but otherwise it can really just go towards the energy storage element and the microgrid controller. So the state funding has really complemented the federal. We need more of it, but has allowed us to kind of think about the supply side of the microgrid as well.
Thanks for the question, Dan, and for the response, Marguerite. And if I'm understanding you correctly, you overlaid these kind of maps of where some of these grants were going with your social vulnerability index map, correct?
Yeah, we're looking at social infrastructure and grid resilience, and providing those metrics and tools for the communities to use. And yeah, we both did that. And what this map on the left was created by our consultants who are doing our draft microgrids roadmap. But I also linked to a tool that it's actually slide 13, MCR application highlights, where we have a tool where you can turn on and off layers, whether that's the social vulnerabilities. Infrastructure vulnerabilities really aren't well mapped. A lot of that is held with the utility and not available. That's why we think this prioritization process is really important for making sure that utility is communicating their vulnerabilities with the social, you know, the community that is looking for the resilience aspects of the microgrid.
Thank you for that. My understanding is that our Colorado guests, who have just done a wonderful job of presenting some of this innovative thinking to us, have to leave after this presentation. So I want to make sure before we end this section that there are not any further questions for them, as they won't be hanging around with us for the additional conversation. Any final questions from the commission or comments? And if I don't see your hand, please do what Hannah did and just speak right up. All right. Well, we just have a lot of thanks to you all for zooming in with us here from Colorado today. It was super interesting to learn about those programs and how you're accomplishing them. And we wish you good luck with those efforts and hope to stay in touch. Thank you both so much.
Thanks so much for having us. Bye.
Thank you.
The next part of our meeting is going to be to return now to Maine's energy system. And it's great to have this additional kind of third-party information to overlay here as we get to listen to our two public utilities, our own commission member, Joe Purington, CEO of Central Maine Power. And we also have John Flynn with us today. He's the president of Versant Power. So in addition to these two big companies, we do know that Maine has a number of smaller municipality and cooperatively owned electric utilities, and they face severe challenges from storms and long-term resilience issues as well. Very much like these smaller communities that these cooperatively owned utilities serve, they deal with staff capacity constraints. So they couldn't join us today, although I know that Brian and the team put some invitations out there. But this is something we need to keep in mind as we consider our recommendations, that we're not just solely dealing with Central Maine Power and Versant, but we're dealing with some of these smaller cooperatives as well. Joe and John, what we've set up is kind of a mini panel with the two of you today. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. The whole thing will be about 30 minutes. We're hoping that you can answer some pretty hefty discussion questions, each of you, in kind of initial 5-minute presentations, and then leave it open for dialogue with the commissioners. So in your remarks, in your opening remarks, if you could please for us, each of you, touch on the key challenges and the recent trends, what's changing for you guys, the opportunities and the highlights, how have you already adapted and what are you looking toward for the future? And then, of course, your key needs, investments, of course, but also coordination, information, etc. And Joe, would you like to start?
Sure. And thanks everyone for the opportunity to not only participate in the commission, but to kind of give you an overview. 5 minutes will never do justice to what we have for a topic here. But if we can go ahead, I've got a little slide deck, and then I'll turn it over to you, John, to kind of add your comments. So I thought first I'd give folks a little overview of our company. 675,000 customers, 11,000 square mile service territory, and we maintain 25,000 miles of power lines. That's enough to go around the earth once. And to boot, we are the most heavily forested state in the nation. And when you look at our customer base, 2/3 of it is within 20 miles of the coast, just to give people a perspective on where our customer density is. So if we can go to the next slide, Brian. So our obligation, and we are regulated, as we heard from Dan and Commissioner Gilbert, we're regulated by FERC on the transmission side, and on the distribution side, the Maine Public Utilities Commission. We are a delivery company. We're like the post office. We deliver packages. We deliver electricity to everybody's homes and businesses. We are not allowed to own generation, and our regulators must ensure that we provide safe, reasonable, and adequate service, and that we minimize the cost of that service. And I think the delicate balance of where Maine is today really lies in the fact that we're trying to keep costs low while maintaining reliable service to our customers. So if we can go to the next, actually just pause for a second. So on our customers' bills, there's three components: the delivery charge, the supply charge, and the public policy charge. We're responsible for the delivery charge, although we bill for all three components. On the other two components, obviously, it's a pass-through for us to our customers and to the people that we're paying, whether it be generators or public policy administration. So Brian, if we go to the next slide. So some of our challenges that we have, I kind of talked a little bit about that, and I'm sure John is going to highlight some more in his area, but we have a high customer vulnerability along the coast. We have limited options for providing alternate sources of power. We have a very rural network. We're geographically a very dispersed state, and we have limited, remote controlled automation on the system at this point. And that, where we see better reliability is obviously in our more urban areas. What we're seeing over the last couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years, as everybody else is experiencing, we're seeing more frequent storm events. We're seeing the weather change. Wind is coming from not the prevailing direction that it has typically come in some of these significant events. We're having wetter ground later in the winter season. And we're seeing actually more hotter days, more precipitation, and more wind and snow events that we have to deal with. And this is a picture of Skowhegan substation back in December that was flooded. So hard to imagine that in December we'd have a flooded substation from a weather event. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is really telling. I think this is a good slide, and we're starting to use it with all of our outreach with stakeholders. But Maine is first for vulnerability to extreme events. And I think what we're starting to see in the last 3 to 5 years is that play out. So very interesting, I think, slide here from Texas A&M University that really compares all states and really puts Maine as the top state for vulnerability to extreme storms. You go to the next slide, Brian. So this is, there's some pictures on the left of some storms, but if you want to look at the top right-hand graph, you'll see that our major storms are increasing each year over the last 2 or 3 years. And you'll see that the customers that are being affected by those major storms are also increasing. I've been with the company for almost close to 40 years. Everybody talks about the 1998 ice storm with fond memories of what a, family, building time it was during those outages. We've had 2 or 3 more significant storms than the ice storm in the last 2 to 3 years that we're seeing on the system. So we're definitely seeing that shift in the weather pattern, and just a few degrees difference in temperature in the winter storms are making all the difference from a dry snow in some parts of our service territory to a wetter snow. So if we can go to the next slide. So here's some pictures from the December 18th, 2023 storm. To give you an idea of what the damage was from that storm. Obviously a multifaceted storm with rain, wind across our service territory. We had about 7,500 individual incidents. We had 1,500 emergency management agency requests. So when we coordinate our responses to public safety calls, we work through the emergency management agencies. We had about 425,000 customers impacted from that storm alone, with a peak of over 355,000 customers. That was right before Christmas, and we were very happy that we were able to restore everybody around Christmas Eve, but it was an intense effort just not even a year ago. We can go to the next slide. Couple more pictures of what happened with the December storm. And Brian, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about the April storm. So 4 months later, in April of this year, we had a very complex storm system come. Another 390,000 customers impacted, with a peak of 330,000 customers impacted. Another 7,000 incidents, 390 broken poles, and 1,600 emergency management agency requests. So when you think about our system, I talked about, the 25,000 miles of transmission and distribution lines on our system. That's held up by about 600,000 poles. And of our our poles, by age, we have about 200,000 poles across our system that are greater than 50 years old. So that just gives you a key indication of, a third of our poles are greater than 50 years old. And those would be, smaller diameter poles, obviously. We go through an inspection process every year, 20% of our system, but our system is aging rapidly. We can go to the next slide. A few more pictures of some of the damage from the storm. Obviously, restoration is a challenge when you have to open up roads first and then, respond to downed wires and then go ahead and start your restoration effort. And again, if you remember, some of the challenges in this storm was right before the total eclipse. And from a logistics perspective, very difficult because all of the hotels were really booked here in Maine. And we had to utilize community systems, whether it be colleges or fire departments or police stations, high school gyms, to set up cots to sleep the workers that came in to assist us from afar. So if we can go to the next slide. So what are we doing about this? I think that's the top of mind question for everybody. Our first priority is to address the foundational grid needs. We need to ensure that we're helping Maine achieve its climate goals and do that all while maintaining affordability and equity. So on the system, I think about the system as being foundational. Every time we touch the grid, every day that we work on it, we have to make it smarter, stronger, and more resilient. So we're putting a lot more switches on the system that will come back to our control center, which will allow us to mitigate the number of customers impacted by each outage. We're building additional circuit ties, which allow an alternate source to reduce the number of customers impacted. And how we build the system with stronger poles, with tree wire, with cutouts on every transformer, with composite cross arms versus wood and steel poles on our transmission system. And now we're starting to move to steel poles on our distribution system, where we're putting on our smart switches so that we can ensure that those operate correctly during our significant events. Our job is to make sure that we facilitate all the infrastructure needs and the smart technology that will allow us to achieve our state's climate goals. We have robust stakeholder engagement plans, whether it be on the integrated grid plan or the climate change plans that are part of the governor's utility accountability bill. And our job is to really continue to look at what are the most cost-effective solutions. And at CMP, while we don't have our reliability for the state based on the conditions that we live in is challenged, we have maintained some of the lowest cost of New England utilities, investor-owned utilities in New England, by being conscious about what our investments are. So we've really focused on our cost to our customers based on what we're hearing, from them. We can go to the next slide. And that's it. John?
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks,
John.
Joe. Hey, thank you for having me. The good news in terms of getting to some question and answers is a lot of what Joe said applies here as well, right? So some differences and a lot of similarities. So a little bit about Versant Power. We are smaller in some ways and not in other ways. So we have about 165,000 customers, over 10,400 square miles. So even more rural than Joe's system, the CMP system. We have about 10,000 miles of lines, combination between transmission and distribution. And, no question that the level of storms we've seen, the intensity of those storms, the frequency of those storms, we had the Christmas storm. Joe and I talk frequently during these storms, and thankful to Joe and his team. Often they have crews that they can make available to us as they finish up, and we're still going, but we finished right before Christmas Eve too. And I think less than 2 weeks later, we were back at it in another 4 or 5 day restoration. And certainly the April storm was huge. I think one of the biggest differences, and Joe touched on it, especially for those winter events, which can be some of the most severe from the perspective of the level of winds, the Christmas storm, the how long those winds blew at very high levels in the Christmas storm, and the direction from which they blew was really unique and different, and it really challenged the system. And the ground was not frozen. That was a huge issue. That's why we saw so many trees come down, so many large trees come down, most often from well out of rights of way, impacting our system, impacting the CMP system, and causing incredible damage. That was actually a really unique storm. Our urban area, Bangor, saw some of the most significant damage it had seen in years, actually in decades. And I had a number of people tell me, you can't tell me you're still assessing damage at day 4 of a storm. We were in that storm. We were still cleaning up trees in Bangor 4 or 5 days later. So we're seeing a lot of the same things. And obviously, as Joe said, the ground being moist in December is a real issue when you're getting those kinds of winds and you're getting heavy snow on lines. So clearly, we're in a different world, and we're seeing it all over Maine. And I love Joe's statistic about us being, I don't love it, but it's a great statistic about Maine being really first in terms of exposure and risk around extreme events. And I think we're seeing that more and more. And like CMP, we're doing a lot of the same things, those foundational grid needs Joe talked about. We're installing a lot of covered wire. We still have, you drive around our system, it's so incredibly rural, especially Aroostook County. But even down towards the coast, we still have some number 6 copper that's hanging on distribution poles. It's been there since the 1950s and 1960s. It's brittle, it breaks. It's subject to any kind of contact, can cause a problem. When you're running fault current over something that small for 60 or 70 years, it's going to be pretty brittle. So we're installing a lot of covered wire. We like CMP, we're sectionalizing, switching the system, so we're able to limit the number of customers that are out in any given period of time and more quickly restore power to a more significant number of customers. The circuit ties, being able to switch the system more strategically and get folks back online. Enhanced vegetation management. The biggest O&M line item in our entire income statement, our entire budget, is vegetation management. We spend nearly $20 million a year on vegetation management, but having to get smarter and more strategic around how we do veg management, and technology, and investing in, we have, if you think about the way power you used to assess outage damage back 20, 30 years ago, you'd have crews drive out to the substation. Once the substation was back on, they'd start literally driving down roads of major feeders and looking for damage and reporting that back. And now that we have full AMI rollout, we can see through our substations begin to see all the way to homes and businesses. And that gives us a much better idea of how to restore power. We've developed a very robust technology roadmap of how we invest in some of the critical technology that allows us better real-time information on the system, along with grid investment. Both of those are expensive. So as Joe said, we've got to do it with a thoughtfulness towards reliability and affordability. And that's one of my biggest concerns as we think about the investments that we need, whether it's from the resilience planning. We're obviously very involved in the resiliency planning work, and the integrated grid planning work. All of those are going to be additional costs on our customers. Looking at actually some United Way statistics yesterday, roughly 50% of the customers in our service territory, and I think it's 45+% in Maine, are either below the federal poverty level, or they're at a point where they're not able to meet their monthly household needs. And so as we do build out the system, as we make these investments over time, we really, really do need to be thoughtful and strategic about when we invest and how we invest, as we have done, as CMP has done, so that we don't just simply heap cost upon our customers, because we know they can't afford it. Versa, like CMP, we're in the lowest quartile of investor-owned distribution and transmission costs in New England. So we have done a really good job, I think, of building out a grid that works and is very reliable, but also doing so in a way that's cost affordable. So very similar story here as to the story that Joe just told for CMP. So with that, I will stop, and we can go to questions.
Thanks so much to both of you. It's really important for us to hear from you guys directly and to hear what you're working on. And I'm sure that the commission has questions and comments about this. I know for myself, our communities are participating in the National ETIP program right now, which the Island Institute facilitates in Maine. We're working very closely with Versant, who's our provider here. In fact, they'll be down here for any of you who are commission members who are interested. We'll be holding a public session next Wednesday about the ETIP program, what we've been doing with it, and how we see microgrids, et cetera, playing a role here on Deer Isle. And one of the issues, of course, we have is we're a rock in the middle of the ocean. So even the thought of burying lines is not an issue. And I'm guessing the answer to your question has to do with cost. But where are you guys thinking about, underground lines and burying things? Since vegetation management is always the #1 issue, the #2 issue for a lot of coastal communities are osprey. So what about burying the lines? How does that fit into your schema?
Joe, you want to take that, or you want me to
Yeah,
take the first run?
I'll start, John, and you can
Okay.
add on to it. So selective undergrounding is a solution in certain areas, right? You got to have the right customer density. It's, it can be anywhere from 4 to 10 times more expensive than an overhead solution. So, as you think about the balance, and I think that's the challenge that, we have with our regulators, it's what's the right balance between reliability of the system and cost to customers. So as we look at, the future and, there's additional technology that's coming out now that is starting to drive down the cost of undergrounding, like cable and conduit installations, which, you can go ahead and trench and just, reel off cable and conduit, which saves time and that saves money for customers. But it's difficult in some areas, to do undergrounding just because of the nature of, the conditions of the soil and the frost. So whenever you have undergrounding, if you have an issue with that, typically it takes us a lot longer to find that issue. We have to thump the cable, put a voltage on that cable. That is a destructive test to find where that fault is. So there are some huge benefits to undergrounding, and there are some obviously some concerns with doing it here in the state of Maine from a cost perspective.
Yeah, I think those are the biggest issues. I think we like CMP, we think about, selective where it makes sense. It is customer density. So we see, for example, a lot of the new housing developments in the Bangor and greater Bangor area are underground. Those make a lot of sense. But they do come with there's a downside to it. An interesting downside that, our parent company, NMAX, is based out of Calgary. Calgary is a much more urban system, was built out underground a number of years ago in many cases. And now what they're finding is, as they're moving deeper and deeper in terms of the penetration of electrification, and the demand on the houses and the businesses is getting much greater. What they're realizing is the way that system was built out, the conductor that was buried is not sufficient. And so when they go to upgrade conductor, they have to tear up entire subdivisions. And so you really need to think strategically about what your system might look like, not just today, but what it might look like in 20 years, because undergrounding does come with cost. And it comes with potential complexity downstream. I'd like to think that as we continue to do the work that we're doing, technology continues to evolve around our ability to manage the system and manage it really effectively in real time, that we can achieve a lot of those same results without having to spend a lot more money to bury too much of our infrastructure.
Great, thanks to you both. Charlie.
So as we saw from the Colorado presentation, batteries are becoming more feature of the electric system, and grid scale batteries, really large scale batteries, are clearly an emerging technology beginning to significantly, mostly as backup to solar and wind, but they also provide resiliency benefits. I have two quick questions. One is, would grid scale batteries be considered generation that you're not allowed to own, or resilience that you might be allowed to own? And under circumstance, do you see a role in the resiliency planning for large scale batteries in the future? And by large scale, I mean at least community scale, as well as single buildings and so on.
So I saw Dan smile, so I thought that was good. So I do believe in our future, battery storage as a grid asset will be be critical. For our system in Maine, and again, I'll go back to cost. It's very expensive to do some of these large scale storage projects in the state now. But as I think about, the future and battery storage as a grid asset, it will help us defer maybe some transmission or some distribution investments. The question is, where on the prioritization list will that fall for us, as we have, fundamental investments that we need to make as well. Like I mentioned, we have 200,000 poles that are over 50 years old. To replace a pole is not cheap as well. So it's finding the right balance in the right situation where a battery would make sense for, a grid asset project to defer an investment that will likely be more cost effective than that investment. But it's really balancing the system needs. So it's not, it's complicated, I should say.
It is, and I think yet at the end of the day, I think the more renewables you have on a system, the more storage you really need to optimize the availability and and address the intermittent nature of those renewables. I think without being an agitator, I think we missed an opportunity in the development of large scale solar in this state to not require those developers to deploy batteries and thus be able to, number one, store their product, and number two, provide a firmer product to the grid. I think, Dan, you're probably familiar, that was done in Massachusetts and as part of a number of the initiatives in Mass. And I think it was a benefit. Charlie, to your other question, I think, look, we actually did identify a couple of years ago through the non-wires alternative process, we did identify a utility scale, grid scale battery that would be fundamentally a resilience, reliability, least cost option for us to regulate voltage for some period of time. And we ran into that, is this resilience question. We were actually willing at the time, to the extent that battery was dispatched into the grid and generated additional value, whether that be through ancillary services or some of the other services that are available, we were more than willing to actually just defer that money and ultimately give it back to customers. But we were not able to move forward with that battery. But I definitely think there will be opportunities for that to be a resiliency type of asset. But as Joe said, the key is back to, we got to prioritize. I had this conversation with Commissioner Scully not too long ago. We can't do it all. So how do we prioritize what we need to do first and what we need to do next? And I think, so where does it fall in the priority scheme is absolutely the right answer.
And John, could you just clarify, you may have said this, but as far as I know, you all don't have the approval yet from the PUC to install batteries. Is that correct?
Do not.
Spanish
we
batteries?
do not. That's correct.
Right. Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. As John mentioned, they put forward a proposal or mechanisms or really kind of boundaries where it could be allowed, but that hasn't made it through any legal or statutory or regulatory process for clarification. So that's an outstanding issue. I was going to pivot a little bit to, I think Joe and John have both talked a lot about technology, and I'm curious, obviously advanced meters that Maine is actually doing quite well in from previous investments. And then and Joe, CMP just received a really significant federal grant. Hoping y'all could talk about the role of new technology to help y'all manage the system a little bit more.
Yeah, so thanks, Dan. So we did get a grant to do really automation on the system and install some more smart switches. We'll be doing that in Androscoggin County. Obviously for us, that's a game changer, because what we're trying to do is segment the grid into 500 customer blocks so that we can, if we have an outage impact, we can, limit it to 500 customers. And we'll do that by installing thousands of these switches. And the switches aren't cheap. They're about $100,000 installed a piece. So very helpful to us as we think about what we're doing with the grid there.
Hannah.
Yeah, very similar here. I think you're switching the system, I think, is critical. And I think as we there's some emerging technologies which we're evaluating as we move more towards real-time management of a very dynamic system. There's going to be the need for some additional technological investments that are going to automate a lot of that in real time, and make it possible for our respective control rooms to really monitor and switch the system and balance the system. Because balancing, running a control, one of the most important things we talk about balancing authority is there has to be, in any electrical system, has to be a real-time balancing of the load and the supply. And that gets much more complex when you get a lot of distributed energy resources on a system. And so the technology to automate the balancing of that is going to be critical as we go forward.
And, I'm really pleased, that, to say to the commissioners here that, the governor's energy office has played a vital role. The technology used to manage, these distributed energy resources on the grid is, we call it an active network manager. And, we've applied for a federal grant to help offset the cost of that to our customers, Versant, CMP, along with support from the governor's energy office. So that's a great example in my mind of how we collaborate as a state to make things happen for our customers and the citizens of the state. So, I do want to, recognize the governor's energy office in doing that and really being very supportive of trying to help, the grid out in that case.
Thanks, Joe and John. Hannah, your question.
I know we're running out of time, Linda, so I will only, this might be a question more for our conversation at the end. But I really appreciate both your presentations and the magnitude of Maine's grid and the trees and the challenge. And we see these accelerating storm events that are having, really challenging impacts for customers. And it is obviously, to accelerate the pace in which we prepare ourselves for these storms will be significant cost. So it's really, I guess my question, at this point, the costs are primarily borne by ratepayers, or almost always, unless there is a federal grant, like you've talked about just now, Joe. Dan has worked on some of these grants. He talked about some of them that have been deployed, but our funding system could be challenging in sort of an accelerated timeframe of having to do a lot of work to better prepare the state for storms. So really, I don't know if anybody has an answer for this, but have other states contemplated sort of, is there any other way to consider how we pay for the kinds of upgrades that are more urgently needed? Because, maybe CMP and Versant could rally the forces to do it all over a couple-year period, but ratepayers couldn't bear that cost, most likely. So I think that's the balancing act of having to accelerate our work. It's true in all other infrastructure, but this infrastructure seems, it really is like fundamental to people's households. And unlike water infrastructure that is, a municipal utility, this is really about people's bills and what they need to keep their homes warm. So maybe a question for conversation. I don't know if either of you have a quick answer other than saying you'd love another way to pay for it.
Yeah, I don't have an example of another way to pay for it other than, us continuing to look for opportunities from federal grants. But I will say this, the integrated grid plan, the climate change plan, the efforts that the governor's energy office are putting forth on really trying to figure out the strategy and the roadmap are critical to how we determine what our investment strategy, where we should invest those dollars over the course of time. So I think about it like we're at a critical crossroads right now where, we need to all get on the same page. It won't be perfect, but it will be directionally correct on our investment strategy for the state. Pull together a 5 to 10 year plan, similar to what's, integrated with the grid plan, and execute that. Not a lot is going to change in the next, 5 to 10 years. I think we kind of see what it's bringing from a generation resource mix and how we'll need to manage the grid on a day-to-day basis based on what we know are going to be, our generating sources. So determining that roadmap and then just starting to execute against that plan annually, reviewing progress annually, but there shouldn't be a lot that changes, or at least significant changes to helping us get there. But it's a 5 to 10 year plan that we need to really, hone in on to start to execute to get us from where we are today to being able to adapt all of that integrated resources on the system, along with batteries, which aren't prevalent yet, but to put us in a better position from a performance on the grid perspective.
I agree with that, and I would just say I think you hit the nail on the head. We need to get after it. We need to begin actioning these plans. We kind of know what's going to happen. I think we can quite reasonably between on the utilities, Governor's Energy Office, the Commission, others. I think we can pretty clearly identify kind of the no regrets investments that we know we need to make first, and not let perfect be the enemy of good. Let's get after it. Let's begin actioning that plan. And then, as Joe said, picking our heads up as we go and evaluating how we're doing and the impact we're having and what to invest in next.
Thank you. One last question before we take a quick stretch break, and that's from Emily. Emily, thanks for your patience.
Sure. And I'll be quick so that we can all go stretch. So I know we're talking a lot about kind of large scale transformational changes. And one of the questions I have has to do with what you're doing now. And you talked a little bit about vegetation management, as well as, kind of highlighting or underscoring the fact that we are the most vegetated or forested state in the country. And I'm wondering, are you restricted on how you clear around the lines? And if you are, what is that restriction? And would lessening that restriction increase reliability of the grid because you wouldn't have as much potential for damage during a storm, as well as hopefully increase your ability to restore power during a storm event, because hopefully they wouldn't be needing as many tree crews to come clear trees before you get to the lines?
Yeah. So Emily, on my yellow sticky note, I wrote down trim. We haven't spent any time talking about trim. We are limited in the envelope that we can do around our wires. But what we've started to do here at CMP is, and I think John's doing something similar at Versant now, is an enhanced tree trim where we go ground to sky. So when you think about the nature of, these heavy, wet snowstorms, it's limbs falling from our zone, which is 10 feet above the wire right now, into, our lines and bringing, the wires down or breaking poles. So we started on that program this year. We changed it in our rate case last year. It was one of the strategies that we had going into it. We were on a 5-year maintenance cycle. And when you look at our outages, it's not really from grow-ins. We don't have trees growing into our lines. So we said, in order to keep costs consistent, if we could go to a 6-year cycle and then implement a ground to sky trim program for, a couple 100 miles a year, that starts to get us, in the right direction. And I can speak from experience, from my time in New Hampshire. What we're doing at CMP right now is the same playbook that we conducted in New Hampshire. A lot of switches and a lot more trim, and that's gonna help us get into a better place from a reliability perspective. It's also important to recognize that we need permission in some cases to do that trim. And in some cases, we don't get that permission. Sometimes it's from municipalities that don't want to allow us to do that trim. Now, our circuits run through many municipalities. They may start in one and go through 3 or 4. We have circuits that are 50, 60, sometimes even 100 miles long. So I think how we think about trim and removing danger trees on our system, and what our customers' perception are when we go in and trim something, it's never pretty, but it needs to be effective for the grid. So, John, I don't.
Yeah, no, same, Joe. We clearly have enhanced our vegetation management program. You hit the nail on the head when you talk about danger trees. That's the other thing we try to do, because what we're seeing, especially in a storm like the Christmas storm or the other January storm where the ground wasn't frozen, is we've got huge trees from outside of our right-of-way. We're trimming inside of our right-of-ways, rights-of-way. What we're seeing is trees coming from outside those rights-of-way and impacting the lines. And so we do, as part of our vegetation management program, look at all danger trees that we can identify that are outside of the rights-of-way, but could impact lines if they fell in totality or in a significant degree. but we need permission to take those danger trees. And as Joe said, we don't always get that permission, but we have taken a significantly greater number of danger trees down over the last 2 years than I think we did previously.
Fantastic. John, thanks for joining us today. Joe, thanks for being both on the commission and for the presentations. They're very, very helpful. And we know we'll be talking again.
Absolutely.
Commission members, yeah, we can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. Commission members, 5 minutes. When you come back, turn your camera back on, and we're going into water-related systems and infrastructure. So be back, please, at 2:51. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. As you come back into the room, if you'd please turn your camera on so I know you're back. I don't want to start the next section without having the majority of us back in the room, if we can. And we especially need to make sure that our three panelists are back. I see two. Lissa.
She's here. I see her.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, welcome back, everybody, and thank you for your good conversation during the last few panels. This is our last panel of the day. I know that as always, we have all of us drinking a little bit from a fire hose, so to speak, and yes, I did use that metaphor intentionally as we come to talk about water. So three of our own commission members are going to now lead a discussion of water systems and infrastructure. This is going to be set up exactly like we just did with John and with Joe. So except we have three panelists. They're each going to take about 5 minutes for their remarks. And then we'll go into Q&A mode. And so really happy to welcome Dr. Puteri Va, the director of the Maine CDC, who will be talking about drinking water systems. Melanie Loisem, the commissioner of the Maine DEP, talking about wastewater systems. And Lissa Robinson, who's a senior civil engineer with GEI Consultants, talking about stormwater infrastructure. If the three of you would each address in 30 seconds or less, something like that. What are the vulnerabilities of each of these systems in Maine that you're seeing? And what are the opportunities to strengthen and protect these systems, especially the priorities that you're seeing? And we'll start with Dr. Va. Thank you.
Hi, Linda, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak a bit about the impact of the changing climate, but of course, more specifically, the impact of the storms on critical public drinking water systems here in Maine. One of the things I think about often and our team thinks about is, of course, like how do we ensure safe, clean drinking water to homes, hospitals, communities, because we know how critical that is. I do want, for those on the commission and listening, just to provide some perspective on where the drinking water program is and how Maine CDC fits into this, is that the drinking water program is under Maine CDC, and we are responsible for ensuring that public water systems provide safe and reliable supplies of drinking water to more than half of the state's population. What this means is that we do regulate as well about 1,900 public water systems. Now, public water systems serve approximately 1/2 of Maine's population. The other half are well water, private wells, and are, when we think about what aspects are vulnerable, how they're vulnerable to the changing climate, typically public water systems are vulnerable to the changing climate and storms. Regardless of whether they use surface water or groundwater as source. I think that's something to think about. Causes include drought, saltwater intrusion, flooding of wellheads. And what this means specifically, especially during the storms that we experience, is that this happens during the storms when the water completely covers the well, and then the well no longer pulls clean water from groundwater, but instead from the flood water, resulting in possible contamination. Power outages impact our water systems, increased runoff that I just mentioned of pollutants and sediment affecting water quality. And then when, something else to think about is increased temperatures leading to microbes and harmful algae growth. Now, more specifically, some examples of how we were impacted by the December storm of 2023. We were impacted actually more there in terms of public water systems than in January. And what that looked like was that there were 4 municipal systems and many smaller public water systems that were flooded. What that meant was that impacted communities It impacted their ability to have access to clean drinking water. For example, Sugarloaf, there were people that were stranded and could not access clean water. What that looked like was that we had wellheads that were underwater. I mean, I mentioned what the impacts of that would be. Washout of large water mains, pumps that were burning out and needing to get pumps from one area to another area. And some of these water systems were offline potentially 1 to 2 days in some of these areas. What we did implement during that same time, and something to consider moving forward in terms of building resiliency, is that we activated the Maine system. What that is the Maine Water and Wastewater Agency Response Network for public water systems. And what that does is that it provides mutual aid and equipment to other public water systems. Every state has one. What this does is that water systems agree to a liability waiver ahead of time. And they're part of this network so that in times of need and emergency, they can assist one another. And what that looks like, for example, is that I believe this might have been Bethel, a system needed help where their pump had burned out. And so they put out a notification of the need. Another water system sees it and they're able to provide assistance. And in real life, what happened was, we had partners willing to drive a pump part from one area of Maine to another area of Maine. But that also, this brings me to the next point. Good cooperation among state and local agencies, as well as partners such as the Maine Rural Association. It's really helpful to have those relationships, especially when you're thinking about redundancies and resiliencies and how you can link each other to resources across the state. Now, what are we doing as a result of this? And how are we hoping to address this? One of the things we are doing is that we are working with Brian and GoPIF, and there was a survey that was created to gather climate change concerns from public water systems. Something that came up in that survey is that most of our water systems were worried that storms could negatively impact them if they haven't already been impacted by storms. We also have a staff dedicated to climate change and resiliency to help us connect our program and how we support public water systems out on the ground. We work with NEMA, and they helped us analyze flooding hazards specific to public water systems and wells to identify vulnerable systems. What that looked like was that it was a GIS study to assess where the wellheads were located, and then looking at elevations of these locations and trying to understand and anticipate which wellheads were more likely to be impacted by flooding. The other thing we did do as a result of those storms is that we updated our drinking water program emergency response plan to be more effective. The team also held a tabletop exercise, and one will be coming up to almost mimic the December storms, to help us put that into muscle memory and how we can support communities on the ground and both small and large drinking water systems. The other thing I wanted to say was that, our drinking water program was also awarded the source protection grants, capacity development grants, and asset security grants to strengthen public water system resiliency. I think that's important to note in terms of resources to support ongoing improvement. But all of this said, how do we support, I think about everything that we were just talking about in terms of the energy grid, and then thinking about drinking water systems and how critical it is in terms of impact to even public health. What can we do as Maine CDC, but then what can we do to strengthen resiliency on the ground? One of the things to think about is awareness. What we're learning about in terms of equity even is that drinking water systems, especially the smaller ones, may not be aware of how to respond to these types of storms, how to prepare for them in terms of building in redundancies and partnerships to help them respond when they are indeed impacted by storms. I think that awareness is really important. The other thing I think about is, how do we connect them to strategies to help them so that they are prepared, again, better prepared when hit by storms, such as the December 2023 storm. Other things that we want to encourage our public water systems is to think about, again, redundancies. For example, having more than one well. Could you have a backup generator? Could you conduct vulnerability assessments, and can we support that to help systems conduct vulnerability assessments, making sure that their emergency response plans take into account climate and storms to be able to address this, making sure that making sure that all of our water systems are signed on to this Me-Warn system or this Me-Warn network. I want to make sure like they have those relationships ahead of time so that when they need to be able to get back online quickly, they can do that through mutual aid. But these are ways how we can help our drinking water systems, especially the smaller ones, to build that level of resiliency. I will end there, but I do understand like some of these conversations are ongoing. But I hope that provides a good overview of what we're doing.
Thank you, Puteri. Thank you so much. Melanie.
Linda, so I'm going to make an assumption that some of you understand the importance of wastewater treatment, but I'm just going to cover it really quickly, right? So our wastewater infrastructure is incredibly important because it collects all of the wastewater that all of us generate on a daily basis. Now, it's not just industrial wastewater, it's all of our wastewater. That's my politest way of saying, right? It all has to go somewhere. And our wastewater treatment plants ensure that bacteria is removed and other pollutants are removed before that treated water is released to our surface waters. So our wastewater treatment plants are incredibly important for protecting not only water quality, but also public health. Many people in Maine live in rural Maine. We have septic systems. For many people who have septic systems, when that pump truck comes to your house and pumps out your septic tank, that also goes to a wastewater treatment plant. So they're important not only for people who live in urban areas that are connected to our sewer systems, but also for those of us who have septic systems. So issues that the wastewater treatment plants and the associated infrastructure are facing due to climate change include things like increased inflows, right? It's just a simple matter of math. There is more water that is falling on the ground that goes into these systems and needs to be treated by these systems. So they were built to handle a certain amount of inflow, and in many cases, due to increased storm events and inflows, they have more flow than they were designed to handle. We have some systems that still have combined sewer and stormwater. And so it's really important as we look at increased storm events to continue to make investments in separating those systems out so we don't have overflow from our sewers going into our surface waters due to storm events. We have flooding of the facilities themselves. The Wiscasset wastewater treatment facility is the best example of that in January. That facility literally had waves lapping at the concrete rim of their aeration ponds. They were bringing out sandbags to hold the tidal waves away from the wastewater that they're supposed to be treating and keeping out of our surface waters. We have overall inundation. Many of these facilities are located in low-lying areas. Gravity flow is the easiest way for these facilities to serve their customers. And so they're in low-lying locations, usually adjacent to some surface water body, usually our rivers that they are designed to treat and then discharge into. So this is critical infrastructure that has been intentionally placed in the locations that are the most vulnerable to the kind of climate impacts that we're seeing. And then the associated piping, the pump stations, all of those are also, just as Dr. Vaugh described, in the same way, experiencing flooding and overtopping. We have mechanical and electronic equipment that is not meant to be submerged, that is being submerged as a resulting of flooding and storm events. We do have the benefit of having a well-established system for providing grants to these facilities, grants and loans through the Clean Water Act, through the State Revolving Loan Fund program. That's been going on for many years. It is a perennial story that the need for funding for wastewater infrastructure exceeds the amount of money that's available for it. So critical infrastructure, you flush your toilet, it happily goes away. People don't like to think about it, but it costs a lot of money to maintain it, right? Climate change is just an additional burden and cost on these systems. So before we were dealing with such extreme climate events, we were looking at about $1 billion in need for ongoing maintenance and repair of these facilities. In the latest annual needs survey that we did for Maine's wastewater treatment plants, we're looking at $2 billion of needs now. And so the cost is only going up. We have been really lucky that we have received a great deal of additional federal funding. In 2024, we had a request for funding for 66 projects through our SRF program. So the total amount of requested funding was $392 million for 1 year. The amount that we had that we could give out in grants and loans was $67 million. We do $25,000 of loan principal forgiveness for every facility that does a climate action plan. Under the federal program that's been approved by EPA that we administer, there is definitely an emphasis on climate resiliency and preparedness. It's already built into the system through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Fund, as well as IRA. There has been unprecedented amounts of federal funding that has been going towards these facilities. I'm sorry to say, I can't imagine how it's ever going to be enough, right? And so we do have a good system for prioritizing projects. We have a well-known and well-established need and a system for trying to meet those needs. But it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where we're ever going to feel like we've got all the funding that we need to do the work to make these facilities more resilient. As I said before, the nature of their location and operation is that they have been placed in some of the most vulnerable areas. The operators and the facility owners, I think maybe in comparison to what Dr. Vaugh described for the public water supplies, this is something they know. They've seen this coming for a long time. They very much understand the impacts that they're seeing to their facilities. We in EPA have been working with them and our counterparts, regionally and nationally, looking at federal flood assistance guidance. Many of the facilities like Ogunquit and Saco have undertaken some major projects to relocate their facilities and their equipment. Wiscasset is considering something similar. So some of our most vulnerable facilities are already working on doing what they can to identify alternatives, to try to make themselves more resilient. And so I would just say, in terms of your question of what is the problem and then what can we do about it, I think that the problem is clearly recognized, and what we can do about it is that we need to continue to support ongoing funding that continues to prioritize funding towards climate resiliency, that these are facilities that know what they need to do. It's municipalities that know what they need to do, but it is incredibly financially challenging for them to do that. And it has been fantastic that over the last several years, there has been increased funding for that, but it's an absolute need that is going to go on for as long as those facilities need to continue to serve us. I also, Brian had suggested that this might be an opportune time for me to put in a plug with the Resilience Commission to talk a little bit also about oil storage. So it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to take advantage while I've got the mic for a moment. That one of the issues that we're seeing at DEP is also, in addition to wastewater management, regarding many of our marinas and our working waterfront facilities, that we have oil fueling operations that are right on the coast. And unlike the wastewater treatment plants, these are operations where there isn't a good funding source for them when they need to make their facilities more resilient to coastal impacts. So it often falls on the customers and the business owners to do things like put in tougher tanks to try to move their pumps back. We are seeing fueling pumps that are right on docks that are literally falling apart. I mean, I have the most frightening pictures I could possibly show you pumps that are connected to live fuel lines that are out on docks that are literally falling apart and piers in coastal Maine. And so I think something that it would be really good for this commission to think about is also just those kind of elements of infrastructure, like the piping we have for wastewater, the piping we have for drinking water, and the piping that we have for fuel, all of which are, installed in locations that are extremely vulnerable to these kind of storm events. And there are programs in place for some of them, but not for all of them. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Melanie. And last but not least, Lissa, talk to us about stormwater infrastructure, please.
I would love to, Linda. Thank you. First of all, I have to say it's an incredible honor to be speaking in the same kind of segment as CDC Director Va and DEP Commissioner Loisem. So I'm very humbled. Speaking about water, wastewater, fresh water, drinking water is really a passion of mine for more than 35 years. I'm a licensed civil engineer, certified hydrogeologist or certified geologist in Maine, and then also went back to school for planning. So I'm constantly in conflict with myself, the engineer versus the geologist versus the planner. So I'll come to this kind of with my center of the road passion when I talk about vulnerabilities of systems in Maine and really some of the more recent experience. So we currently, a small team of engineers and geologists and planners here in Maine working for a consulting firm, we are seeing exactly the things that Joe was talking about: more frequent storm events, wetter ground, weather intensity is increasing, the duration is increasing, the depths and the intensities again are causing issues. And I'll use culverts as an example, as kind of a proxy for things that are happening across the state in terms of stormwater. So more frequent flooding, aging infrastructure, and really a lack of information, comprehensive information across the state for flooding. We do have FEMA maps. We do have FEMA hydraulic studies, but they're limited. They're limited to certain locations in Maine. And also when we talk FEMA coastal mapping versus FEMA inland mapping, they are two different beasts. The FEMA coastal mapping will talk about ocean issues. But if you have a small stream in a coastal community that is having flooding from a rain event, there isn't really any information in FEMA that can speak to that. So that's a little bit of one discrepancy. You might call it an opportunity. The other type of issue is when communities go and they have a problem with a culvert, they might go in and replace that one culvert. That might be creating issues upstream and downstream. So we really need to look at system-wide issues and studies and information. And Chief Engineer Joyce Taylor did a good job of explaining that from the DOT's perspective, how important it is to look at watershed-wide studies and evaluations. Groundwater and surface water, they don't know about municipal boundaries. They know about topography and terrain, so it is a system issue. And another thing that we are finding is that municipalities lack guidance on how to address extreme flooding. So for example, the state has bridge design guidelines that will help with culvert replacement, but there are no specific and consistent guidelines across all 400 plus municipalities that we have in the state of Maine, leaving some communities that might not have engineers on staff to deal with consistent fixes for that one-of culvert and for their system-wide culverts. So opportunities to strengthen and protect, I would say tools for decision-making. And that would include system-wide watershed analyses, the ability to replace culverts with a systems approach. And then one thing that really caught my attention was Sam Brody and his mention of statewide hydraulic modeling. That would be a game changer for the state of Maine in terms of replacement of bridges and culverts, for helping communities, for being consistent, for making sure that the culvert replacement isn't going to impact the municipality downstream. That seriously would be a game changer for Maine to look at a statewide hydrologic and hydraulic model. We're already doing that type of watershed work for dams that we work on in the state of Maine and all across the country. We're doing a lot of risk analysis. again, for dams. But when we're talking about stormwater infrastructure, which would be culverts and bridges in the state, we are really lacking some comprehensive tools. And really, I think giving people tools for making smart decisions about where they live. So again, Texas has a program where you can click on a lot and see what your vulnerability is for flooding. This is influencing decision-making. We have some of that information in Maine, but definitely not to the degree that we could be helping people make smart decisions about where they might live. In other words, directing humans away from vulnerable settings. And I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll give it back to you, Linda. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much. And I was just made aware that Dr. Va has to leave us, so I'd like to start with the Commission's questions for her about drinking water systems. And I will start with a question regarding, I know we're focused very much with this commission on storm damage and on recovery from storms. That said, this is about infrastructure resilience and rebuilding. And I'm wondering, Dr. Va, about sea level rise in general. And I know you talked about incursions to drinking water systems, but how are you approaching the accelerated sea level rise in the Gulf of Maine? How many of our public water systems is that impacting, and what steps are you recommending for that?
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for that question. Those are all the questions that we're asking ourselves. And I think the first thing I would probably emphasize, this is where our partnership with MEMA to identify those vulnerable water systems is really critical. Because it's looking at just that, like geographically, where are these water systems? How elevated are they? And if we're anticipating sea level rise, what percentage of those systems are in those vulnerable sites? I believe that assessment, and I know we have our MEMA partners here too, but I believe it recognized maybe 4%, but don't quote me on that one. We're going to get a better percentage of, more clear confirmation of what percent that was. But what that means now, once we identify those sites, or in those identified sites, we need to work with them to figure out how to rebuild, or how to make sure that those wellheads are not, anticipating the sea level rise, that they are structurally set up where they're not going to be sensitive to that, right, to that vulnerability. But we're asking those questions, those very same questions. We need to identify those sites, and I believe those sites have been identified. And then what are we going to do to work with those systems to help them?
Thank you, Dr. Va. I noted that Pete Slavinsky in the comments said that he's also talking about seawater intrusion for private wells and septic systems, and said that there is a monitoring network that will be established with funding from a recently received NOAA Regional Resilience Grant. So that's at least part of that. Thank you for your response to that, Dr. Vaughn, for your presentation. We totally understand if you have to leave to go to another meeting. Commissioner Loisem also has to leave shortly to get to a climate council meeting to travel for that. So, and I just wanted to start with Commissioner Loisem by saying that your statement, I can't imagine how it's ever going to be enough, is something I think that we feel in all of our communities, at least. I'll speak for myself, I guess. We certainly feel it here on Deer Isle, Stonington. So, we know that funding and the financial part of this is a huge chunk of this. What else can we think about? Are there any shortcuts? Are there things that communities can do as we address this issue with wastewater?
That is a great question, Linda. Some of those things include, for instance, if you are served by a sewer system, there are communities where remarkably, I don't understand this. I haven't ever lived in a place where this is the case, but things like the downspouts from your roof are connected to the sewer system, so that all of the stormwater that hits impervious surfaces goes into the treatment system. That's just really not necessary. All the ways that a community can look at the loading into the system. It connects also to what Lissa was talking about in terms of stormwater management. We have old systems that have a great deal of infiltration, where they're taking on additional inflows that they don't necessarily need to. And so it's important for communities to look at the way that they are built, the way that they plan to build, what they're doing in terms of stormwater management and wastewater management, and work with those wastewater districts and think about minimizing the inflows to the system, and where there is what I would call relatively clean water that doesn't need to go into the system, that can go to vegetated surfaces that are capable of providing pollution treatment essentially through natural systems when it's very minor, coming off of things like rooftops and parking lots. There are other options for the way that certain types of stormwater and wastewater can be managed, to try to focus the work of our treatment systems really on the inflows that are absolutely necessary to go there. And for our communities to also support relocation of some of the infrastructure and stabilizing of the infrastructure. Nobody wants to live next to an aeration pond, right? It's just the reality of things. And in some cases, we have some facilities where parts of their infrastructure are going to need to be relocated. That where they are now, there's very little that can be done that's going to make them truly resilient for the next 50 to 100 years, which is the lifespan that we need for that kind of infrastructure. And so communities and planning boards need to be willing to work with the districts to think about the kind of locations where that sort of critical infrastructure can be moved. And as I said before, continuing to not let people forget that even though wastewater sometimes is the hidden infrastructure that people don't like to talk about or think about, that it needs to remain a priority for federal funding. Now, the kind of funding that we've seen in the recent federal legislation has been unprecedented and has finally started to feel like it's recognizing the importance of that infrastructure, given the situation that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Melanie. I really want to second that having the infrastructure money flowing into the communities, as it were, has been a huge sense of relief for many of us, as it clearly is for you, because the investment needs are so large, and these last couple of years have really made a difference in that regard. I also thank you for your response in terms of linking the different systems, because that is one of the questions I think we constantly have to address, is how are these systems linked or not linked? How should they be linked? How should they not be linked? Where does drinking water and stormwater and wastewater, where do they intersect, and where can we effectively plan in different ways? And that's probably a good question for Lissa, actually. And again, Melanie, if you have to depart during this, we thank you so much for both being on the commission and for your presentation today, and for all you're doing on these issues. Thank you. Lissa, do you want to tackle that question of the intersection of the three water systems?
Can you phrase the question?
Sure. In just listening to all three of you talk, it's clear that there are both unintended intersections, but maybe some intentional intersections that could be explored as we're talking about rebuilding and restructuring things. And I'm just curious as to your thoughts about all of that.
Sure, thank you. In the 90s, there was increasing interest in doing townwide hydrogeologic investigations. Communities were interested in sometimes the same issues of septic system soil carrying capacity, and in terms of drinking water, making sure septic systems weren't impacting drinking water supplies and making sure saltwater intrusion wasn't happening in the coastal setting. And then, of course, with stormwater, making sure that especially what we call dug wells. Dug wells are wells that are in soil as opposed to wells that are in bedrock. It's the dug wells with the well casings where you can have infiltration of stormwater that is contaminated and harm the supply. So these towns, it was a really interesting initiative. And typically, I guess they all were towns in the coastal settings. I guess, you know, at the time they were feeling threatened and vulnerable, and they were undertaking these studies. I think when I was working for another small firm, we must have done 20 of them. And perhaps there was funding, perhaps there was threatened, you know, there was threatened from dense development, and there were pressures on the communities at the time. And so we really did see that nexus of these three areas, especially with regard to private water supply wells and private septic systems. So if we take public water systems off the table and just focus on those private water systems, one of the issues was that there were no regulations that would protect, for example, water supply wells. And some of the information that Sam points out in his chat is that there's some inconsistency. If somebody has a private well and they want to get their well water tested, they will have to go and buy the water kits, get their water samples done and deliver them to the lab, whether it's a state lab or a private lab. So that's, you know, takes initiative, it costs money. And then the results really are held private. And so one interesting thing that we were doing was we were asking the state lab, for those people who submitted their samples to the state, to release that information in a confidential manner. We never highlighted who the property owner was, but it gave us a chance to look at some of the issues with public water, with private water supply wells. So we started to kind of connect the dots between stormwater, well water, and wastewater. Although, you know, that was kind of a point in time. You do the study then can collect dust if there's no action taken. So towns that did have vulnerabilities for private wells were thinking about where they could put public water supply wells. Towns with vulnerabilities for septic systems that were contaminating water supply wells would then have setbacks for septic systems and wells. And there's an interesting topic on that, is that there were no guidelines for how close you could put your well to your septic system. And in theory, you should be at least 200 feet away so that you're not introducing bacteria and pathogens, bacteria and viruses from your wastewater or your neighbor's wastewater to your well. So again, it was pretty, and I think still is, somewhat loose in terms of protecting private water supply wells, private wastewater systems. And then really stormwater is a separate topic somewhat. So, you know, I don't know how to wrap that all into one item, except to say, I think this private landowners and private well owners and private wastewater are of particular concern to Maine, and those in the coastal setting are considerably more vulnerable than others inland. I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, thank you for your response to that, Lissa. And Sam Roy, I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything, but I see from your note in the chat that, you know, we don't have a good communication system either for the private systems, right? So that MEMA was learning anecdotally about drinking water vulnerabilities as they happened during the December storm. So I don't know if we need to say anything further about that. Anne, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can respond on the emergency management side. And just a clarification, we had started conversations with Maine CDC more done in drought times than with the December storm. It's more the private data that Lisa just alluded to than the public sector information, which is more readily available. But as Dr. Va alluded to, our critical infrastructure protection officer is coordinating with the Maine drinking water program. And so we're sharing the information we have, but it's specifically the private infrastructure data for private wells, drinking water systems that just continue to be an issue and less accessible for us to gain access to and share information on.
Thank you, Anne. We have lost two of our panelists to other meetings, but Charlie, you've got a question, and then Judy.
I just wanted to add to the we've been doing a study of the water and wastewater systems in Saco Bay for the last 4 years with funding from NOAA. And there are two vulnerabilities that we uncovered that are get a lot less attention. Our work on systems with Maine Water, which is a private utility serving that area. The things we uncovered because we modeled sea level rise as it would occur across from Pine Point to Camp Ellis, is that at about 5 feet of sea level rise, a lot of homes have their water system intake, which is above ground, flooded. And so you're going to get a lot of potential losses to individual homes that are not necessarily covered by the larger question of, for example, replacing the 100-year-old cast iron pipes. It's a more subtle but potentially large threat in all of the water systems from sea level rise. With the Saco wastewater treatment plant, one of the things we was that the wastewater is discharged into the Saco River, and the Saco River is designed to carry the wastewater, treated water, back out to the ocean for diffusion. But the plant relies only on the Saco River, also on the tidal difference that pushes because it's tidal all the way up to the dams. The difference between low tide, the ebb tide is an essential part of distributing the treated wastewater. And essentially the current plant, which will be rebuilt, cannot discharge. The river is above 9, above 9. Don't worry about the measurement. There's a threshold above which cannot discharge and must hold the wastewater until the next tide cycle. With sea level rise in about more than a 50% chance after 2050, the tide is never high. The low tide never below the threshold level because the entire tidal cycle gets pushed up. And so the discharge, it's not just the plant itself subject to flooding. It's the whole system of discharge affected by sea level rise that creates another significant vulnerability. And in fact, it creates a vulnerability to whether you shift the onshore facilities or the sea level rise steadily decrease the time when wastewater can be discharged from plants that rely upon the cycle to diffuse the wastewater. So these are more subtle things, but they add up time to other things we need to pay to. And with that, I have to go to another meeting.
We are beset with other meetings today. Charlie, we had a really bad echo with you today, but I appreciate you bringing that last issue in because of, I think the tides and sea level rise and the outflow of our systems is a really important one to address. So thank you for putting that on the table. Judy.
Thank you, Linda. I think what Charlie just raised may be an issue in more than just that one location. I'm questioning that. I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention, there is an MOU between Maine Geological Survey and the CDC to coordinate the databases that they maintain on wells. And my memory isn't good enough to remember the details. Steve Dixon was working on it before he left, and we'll be picking that up as Ryan Gordon, the new state geologist, continues to take on all of his new tasks. But that's just one integration of databases that I think is important to keep in mind here. The other thing that Lissa, that you raised, that a system-wide watershed analysis that supports tools for decision making, I couldn't agree more. There was a meeting a couple of weeks ago with Maine DOT, GOPIF, Maine Geological Survey, and we hope to bring others in, looking at what the data needs and the funding needs are for statewide inland flooding model. Maine DOT has done some work, and Joyce can speak to this in terms of it being a little too general the first go around to be of use. And so the NOAA grant does have some funding that can contribute to this. It won't be enough. And so we're also examining other funding sources there and who else to include. Pete, did you want to add on to that particular, no, not the inland flooding model, but I just wanted people to be aware of that. And we're also paying very close attention to what Massachusetts has done. They've already hired a consulting firm. Brian, you met with them in late August, and whether or not you want to tag on to this comment, but just that'll give us some indication of the data needs, the scale, the scope, the funding need. We certainly have data needs before we can reach a good watershed analysis that Lisa, I hear you wanting, and I've wanted it for years, and it's so much harder to do than I ever thought. But it is something that I was glad to see was in some of the recommendations in the initial framework from the meeting that I wasn't able to attend in early, or whenever that was, early September. So to be continued in response to what you'd love to see.
Yeah, and just an add-on to that, you bring up the 1987 request that any new wells installed in Maine, the requirement was that the well driller would submit a copy of the report to the state. And it seems like such a simple gesture, but I can't tell you how that has been a game changer for people, engineers or geologists or anybody that is evaluating wells or water in Maine. Really big game changer. So just a shout out for that, way back when. And the inland flood model, yes. And Joyce, I should probably defer to her for speaking about that. But, I'm doing a culvert replacement in north and west of Augusta, and there's literally no information. I have to go to Stream Stats and get statistical information. There's no FEMA maps, no FEMA hydraulic models that I could look at. So thank you for supporting that.
Judy and Lisa, thank you for bringing all this information to our attention. Very, very much appreciated. We're pretty much segueing. I see 2 hands up. I see both you, Pete and Hannah. Don't worry, I'm going to get there. We are segueing kind of into the end of the meeting here, though, and we can just kind of do this naturally. So everybody just keep in mind that this is where we really need to hear from you about what recommendations are emerging for you. What additional information or research is needed. So we just heard about the data needs there that are still needed in order to make some of these floodwater and I'm going to use the wrong terms, assessments. And then based on what you heard today, where should the commission continue its focus? So with these questions in mind, as we roll toward 4 o'clock, Pete, you have your hand up, and then Hannah.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Our discussion got me thinking about one of the issues that is cropping up on a fairly regular basis. And it was already mentioned that a lot of these facilities are located in low-lying vulnerable areas. And some of them are also in regulated dune systems, which complicates the process for making these systems more resilient. So, and for example, we talked a little bit about the Ogunquit wastewater treatment plant. I mean, it's literally right in the frontal dune system. There are several other facilities that are also right in dunes where we have very, very, very restrictive regulations on what can and cannot be done in those areas in terms of protecting them or making them more resilient. So one of the things I would posit for us to think about is, and this also, relates to transportation networks and roadways and things like that, because if things are getting elevated, they have a bigger impact and they go out. And the DOT folks could talk about that endlessly. And you're impacting natural resources. So we need to think about how we balance the resilience of these systems with the existing regulations we have in place, and or whether or not some of those regulations need to be either tightened or loosened to allow for some of these resilient activities to be occurring. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. Hannah.
Great. Well, thank you, Linda. You've done a very good job managing this whole meeting. So nicely done. And I'm looking at Brian's questions here, and I was sort of in my mind switching to those. I would say I really appreciate Lisa's comment about the hydrological survey. I feel like throughout the course of this whole commission, we continue to hear about data needs, and I think they're on Brian's list. But when we come back together in October, I mean, I think it would be helpful to kind of think about all of the data projects the state has underway, and then some of the needs that have been identified, because there are a lot of them. And I know we have I think Sam Brody is out here, and his team is thinking about this question as well. And I just want to tell everybody that I think he will start to share information in this with all of us about what we have and what we don't have. But I mean, this whole conversation about water infrastructure is about how do we identify what is most vulnerable, and then you sort of layer on how able is that community, how able to pay is that community. And I think the question of just understanding priorities is very challenging, because we have heard about so many needs. So I would just say, I think maybe our GoPIF team working with Sam, I think just understanding all of the data things that are happening, and sort of where are we in terms of understanding vulnerability. I think there's so much opportunity for this commission to help drive that conversation about the kind of data that communities and decision makers need. But I would say the other theme is there is not enough money for anything compared to the scale of change we're seeing and the cost of infrastructure. And so I think that the data is important for that as well. I also just want to kind of go back to Dan Burgess's presentation, because I think we are at this meeting sort of thinking about all types of utility infrastructure, and clearly the grid is a big one. Dan put some recommendations out there. I think they were high level. I think maybe we show that slide quickly, but I'm sort of wondering, does the commission feel good about at least putting them on the list for consideration? Because I do think we have a very short time frame to put ideas and concepts out there. I think some of Dan's recommendations were about how we better consider these issues and how the state might move forward. I won't necessarily ask Dan here, but I think like who would do these things is a question I had for Dan. I know his team may have a few more details on that. I will stop talking, but I would say Melanie made the comment about pipelines and gas storage. Lissa brought up dams. I know many of these things are on the state hazard mitigation plan, but there are these kind of key pieces of vulnerable infrastructure, and when they fail, it's a huge problem. I just would add, maybe it's for the list, but the grid is the poles and wires that keep us all connected. We haven't talked about communications infrastructure, meaning Maine Connectivity Authority, our broadband infrastructure, our telephone infrastructure. I think some people still are using that in Maine. I still have a landline, but I think it's on the internet. But I would say communications infrastructure is sort of something we have left out, and at least it should be on the list of something that is needed, certainly, to manage our day-to-day lives, especially in emergencies. So Dan, I don't know if you have anything more to say, but I'd love a sense of if these recommendations are ones we should at least continue to consider. People could put in the chat if they think anything's missing.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to respond if there's a little bit of time for that. I mean, I think who does what on a few of these will probably be a few. We can certainly spend some time thinking about. I think a lot of these are happening at the Energy Office and the Commission, but a few of them are happening in other areas too. The CRP program and the GoPIF team, and we didn't have the bandwidth today to get into it, but Efficiency Maine is offering rebates for energy storage projects right now, and has some opportunities for increased resilience. Maybe not. Depends how you define microgrid, but at least kind of backup power. And legislature asked them actually to review opportunities for critical infrastructure projects and how energy storage could be a component there. And so I think we definitely like to explore some of these and see opportunities to learn from other states and take stock of what's happening to really refine what's in the final recommendations. I will just say we are going to have future rounds of grid resilience programming coming, as we've mentioned, and so we want to make sure to make the most of those. And yeah, but I think would be happy to drill down on some of these going forward too.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Hannah, for those thoughts. And Dan, one of the things I really heard today is this, just for me, it really put into highlight that, we could just deal with columns of what our critical infrastructure is. And as Judy just emphasized in the chat, communications infrastructure, that's the first thing. When that goes down, we can't communicate between emergency responders and we can't communicate with each other. And that actually freaks our communities out more than almost anything, right? Then it's only after that that they notice that they don't have clean drinking water, which is essential to their survival. But so the communications infrastructure has absolutely got to be on the infrastructure list of critical infrastructure. And if we are indeed a commission on infrastructure rebuilding and resilience, we have to take into account all of the channels of critical infrastructure and then be able to prioritize, as Hannah was saying, because there's not enough money to go around, and we're going to have to do things in a sequence that makes the most sense given the challenges that are facing us and that we're all aware of. So getting some kind of data that helps us prioritize these recommendations is going to be super, super important, I think. That said, we are at a really critical juncture with this commission. I want everybody to be aware this was kind of our last fact gathering meeting, right? Our kind of last of our learning sessions. We're really now at the point where starting in October, we're going to be putting the recommendations on the table and starting to look at, review, prioritize, discuss, argue, all these things around where everybody's got their needs in the game, right? So that's going to be important, and we need to be able to move into this next part. One of the things Brian and I talked about as we were setting this meeting up was, he's been taking great notes from all of these concluding sessions where we're talking about what recommendations are rising to the top for us. And I have asked him if he would distribute those as a set. So we have all of the meetings, all of the recommendations from all of the meetings in front of us so that we can really be reminded and reflect on those before our October meeting. And as part of that, because there's been a lot of information and a lot of recommendations, and kind of managing them and keeping track of them is going to be a challenge in and of itself. So we do have time for a couple of more comments and questions from you all. Anybody? Brian, do you want to put up your slide from today's, what you've heard today, recommendations you've captured for today?
Thanks, Linda. Just give me 1 second here.
Sure thing. He's doing this in live time, so we owe him a lot of thanks for his ability to capture this information and for sorting through all those slides and getting things in front of us during the entire meeting. Thank you, Brian.
So I was just catching the last bit of the conversation here when we sort of shifted into the discussion, hoping that my colleagues Maggie and Hannah also captured some notes here too. But this is ideas around the statewide hydrologic and flooding model, how to balance resiliency goals with environmental regulations, how to identify vulnerable water infrastructure and pay for those improvements, and then all of the recommendations that the Energy Office shared from the previous slide will make their way in here as well. And then this was, I think, a really great point of sharpening that list of our data needs, data gaps, trying to understand what it is that we will need as a commission to make decisions this fall and make prioritizations, and then longer term data needs where we want to understand our systems better, our vulnerabilities better, so that we can continue this work over the longer term.
And Sam Brody, I think you're still in the room. That's something you're really giving us a hand with, is it not? Do you want to speak to that at all?
You mean in terms of the data need?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one of our initial deliverables is to understand what is available for Maine, what we can do with that. There's going to be a lot of, hey, wish we had this. And I think some of the recommendations that we propose would be around, okay, in the future, collect this data, track this data for this purpose. part of the challenge is figuring out before you go and do a study or collect data, what questions do you want to answer with it? And so it's kind of the chicken and the egg, but I've seen a lot of initiatives go sideways because where hundreds of millions of dollars are spent and the result is a lot of data that can't be used or didn't answer the original questions. We're going to do some pilot analysis is our plan, and kind of lay out a potential process for you all to think about. Again, what I don't want to do is, even though I'm an expert, jump the gun and say, hey, this is what we produced for you as something you should use. It's more, here's a needs assessment. Here's where you could go in the future. Here's an example of how you could do this, because some of this is going to get into more subjective decision points, like baking in different degrees of social vulnerability and prioritizing value sets. So just when I do deliver analysis, just couch it in terms of this is an example. It's ultimately up to the state of Maine to decide how they're going to proceed. We're deep. You guys have all been the people we've talked to have it's been great conversations, really. And yesterday was a deep dive into insurance data, and it's really helping us and Brian kind of gather more information 101 and figure out what data is possible, both now and in the future. Because I really think it starts with data and segues into more resilient decisions. So that's just my 2 cents. I've been hanging on to every word of the last 3 hours, so appreciate the invite.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for chiming in, and the work that you're doing, pulling it all together for us is so important, and we're really grateful for that. And especially because one of the things I also heard a little bit of today, and it began to raise my warning bells about this, which happens often in Maine, which is if the PUC is working over here on resilience plans, and the companies or the power companies are working over here with their resilience plans, and the governor's office is working over here, and we're working over here. So what is really bringing all of those layers together into something that can be really meaningful and impactful, especially when one of the things we're talking about so much is the lack of capacity, whether it's human or funding capacity. So I don't think there can be any room for redundance or for us working in parallel, unless by working in parallel, we're really advancing each other's efforts and working toward the same goals. Judy.
Couldn't agree more, Linda. And one of the things that we had the first meeting of the steering committee of the all of the agencies that are on the steering committee for the implementation of the NOAA grant. And it was just so energizing to see just the level of interagency coordination and also what we're hoping for with this inland flood effort. And also, great point, Sam. The very first thing that we said we need is clear problem identification. What do we need the data for? Not just assembling data. So couldn't agree more.
And I think part of that will come down to priorities. And I think that that's going to be the tough part that we begin in our next meeting in 2 weeks, right? Is from all that we've heard and all the recommendations that are rising to the top for us, where are the priorities? And to me, that means how are things sequenced in a way that we're making the most sense in terms of hitting the most critical areas first and moving out, because they all feel critical and they are all critical to everybody. I just want to point out for those of you who maybe have trouble watching the chat while we're talking, Anne brought up the fact that we really need to bring the recommendations out to all seasons, because extreme weather is not just winter-based. It's not even just extreme heat in the summer. It's also that we heard from our communities in the western regions that they had storms in June and May of the previous year before the December storm that knocked out major infrastructure for them. So we really do need to think about that. And then the communications points again, including the social networks and community communications, and how do we tie these systems all together so that the MEMA and the regional emergency management agencies are all well connected to our municipalities, and all have the same information that they're sharing at the same time. And Lissa asked, her last comment is about how are we thinking about tools to help decide how to build and rebuild so that we direct new builds and rebuilds away from vulnerable settings. So that's, I know that's part of Sam's thinking in terms of the recommendations that he has made in Houston and other places. So that, and Judy has added that that is a focus of the NOAA grant. Last thoughts, last comments for today.
I would just like to offer this. You know, there are 22 cities, there are 430 towns, there are 29 plantations, and there are thousands of unincorporated areas of the state. There's virtually no way we could do this on a town by town, city by city basis. And I think one of the things that strikes me throughout all of these meetings that we've had and the various site visits is the size of the problem is so huge, we have to take a more rational, regionalized approach. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when, you know, we give a grant to the town of Booth Bay, but not Booth Bay Harbor or Edgecombe or Southport. And I think that we should be incenting communities to work together more than we do. And we also need to recognize that many, I read the Island Institute's newspaper as a postal. And some towns have, you know, good resources. They got some geologist who retired from MIT who, you know, is going to volunteer his time and help out the community, develop an application to a grant. But the next town over could be just as in need, but they don't have a retired geologist or engineer who's willing to volunteer his time. So I think that we need to think about the tools that we, as a state, are able to provide communities to work together and succeed as regions more than individual town by town. I was struck by the town manager in Machias who said, you know, just help us out, you know, give us the money. You know, and you could feel it, you know, he was in his core, but we couldn't just, you know, we funded Machias, maybe we couldn't fund Machias for. So I think we need to think as a commission, what's the way to incent communities to work together in a regional solution? And I also would echo others' comments that sometimes rebuilding is not the answer. And we need to think about it. Those are hard conversations, but we shouldn't keep perpetuating the same mistakes. You know, I was listening to a FEMA meeting the other day, and they talked about they had rebuilt some guy's home like 10 times. And they kept getting washed out to sea. And I was like, well, you know, after the third time, I would be like, yeah, I'm sorry, we don't have any more money to rebuild the home. But I think we need to make some hard decisions. And I just would impress upon this group that we will do ourselves a disservice if we didn't really make some hard decisions and hard recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I think those are important thoughts to close on. You know, even coming from an island community, I couldn't agree with you more about regionalization. Islands tend to see themselves as, you know, entities unto themselves, but we're not, and I don't see it that way. I mean, I do see us as part of the larger region in all levels, and so I think that that's a really important thought that you're leaving us with. And I wanted to add, since you mentioned Bill from Machias, I don't know how many of you heard that he has sadly passed away, and how many of you received that news since we met with him. But very sad news from somebody who gave a lot of himself, obviously, to his town and to us during our visit there. So just wanted to make that note and make sure you had all heard that. So yeah, we've got some hard decisions coming up in terms of priorities and sorting through all these recommendations. So we next meet in 2 weeks. We have a lot of thanks today to our guests from the PUC, our guests coming in from Colorado, and from Versant Power for joining us, along with Joe, of course, our own commission member, and all of you as commission members who were on panels today and brought your wisdom and expertise to the fore. Really grateful for that and grateful for the impact this will have. Brian will be circulating some notes. Hopefully you'll have a chance to look at those before we meet again in 2 weeks. And otherwise, we will see you on October 2nd in Augusta in person. Brian, anything else?
No, thank you, Linda. Thank you all for being here. We will send, as Linda said, notes and more information about the in-person meeting. So it'll be the regular time, 1 to 4, and we'll share the location data with you. There'll be a hybrid option if you do need to participate remotely, but we'd really love to see you in person.
Okay, hope to see you all in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.